Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold seeping through the cracked windows of my rental car, nor the way the blizzard had transformed the mountain road into an impenetrable wall of white. It was the silence that followed when I turned off the engine. A silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton soaked in dread. The Grandview Hotel loomed before me through the swirling snow, its Victorian silhouette carved against the storm like a tombstone against a gray sky. Every window was dark except for a single amber glow emanating from what I assumed was the lobby. The building seemed to lean slightly forward, as if straining to get a better look at me. My hands trembled as I retrieved my briefcase from the back seat, though I told myself it was just the cold. The quarterly reports inside felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by the knowledge that I'd never make tomorrow's presentation in Denver. The storm had swallowed the interstate whole, and my phone had lost signal 3 hours ago when I'd taken this detour through what the GPS had optimistically labeled a scenic route. The lobby door opened before I could reach for the handle. "Welcome to the Grandview," the receptionist said, though his voice seemed to come from somewhere behind me rather than from his position at the mahogany desk. He was impossibly tall and thin, with skin that looked like parchment left too long in the sun. His eyes were the color of old pennies, tarnished and dull. Terrible weather for traveling. I explained my situation: the storm, the blocked roads, the need for a room until morning. He listened with his head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at him, nodding at intervals that didn't quite match the rhythm of my words. "Room 237, he said, sliding a brass key across the desk. The metal was warm to the touch, almost fever-hot. "Third floor. Elevator's been temperamental. Best to take the stairs." The key felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of lead rather than brass. When I asked about other guests, about how many people typically stayed here during storms, his smile stretched a fraction too wide. "We've had many guests over the years," he said, his eyes focusing somewhere past my left shoulder. "They all find what they're looking for eventually." The stairs creaked under my weight with a sound like breaking bones. Each step seemed to echo longer than physics would allow, reverberating through the walls until I couldn't tell if the footsteps I heard were my own or someone else's, somewhere above or below me in the building's vertical maze. The hallway on the third floor stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with doors that seemed to multiply the longer I looked at them. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with a pattern that hurt to focus on, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The carpet runner was threadbare and stained with dark patches that looked almost black in the dim light from the overhead fixtures. Room 237 was halfway down the hall, or at least it seemed to be when I started walking. By the time I reached it, I could have sworn I'd passed at least 30 doors, though when I turned to look back, the hallway behind me appeared no longer than it should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled with the key, my hands slick with sweat, despite the cold that seeped through the walls. The room was smaller than I'd expected, with a single window that looked out onto what should have been the parking lot, but showed only swirling darkness. The bed was made with hospital corners so tight they looked painful. A radiator in the corner hissed and clanked with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of labored breathing. I set my briefcase on the small desk and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest like a cold stone. Business trips had taken me to countless hotels over the years, some grand, some seedy, most forgettable. But I'd never felt this sense of wrongness, this feeling that the building itself was watching me with hungry eyes. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by sounds that had no source I could identify. Footsteps in the hallway at 3 in the morning, slow and deliberate. A soft tapping at the walls that seemed to move from room to room like a message being passed along in code. Whispers that might have been the wind or might have been voices speaking words in a language I didn't recognize. When I finally gave up on sleep and checked my watch, it was still 3:17 a.m. the same time it had been when I'd last looked, though I was certain at least an hour had passed. The digital display flickered as I stared at it, the numbers seeming to swim before settling back into place. I decided to find ice, anything to get out of that room and move around. The ice machine, according to a faded sign by the elevator, was at the end of the hall. But when I opened my door and stepped into the corridor, the hallway had changed. Where there had been burgundy wallpaper, now there were mirrors, dozens of them, reflecting my image back and forth into infinity. My reflection looked haggard and strange, as if I'd aged years in the few hours since I'd arrived. The ice machine wasn't where the sign said it would be. In fact, the hallway seemed to bend and curve in ways that defied the building's structure. I found myself walking for what felt like 20 minutes, past doors that all looked the same except for their numbers, which seemed to follow no logical sequence. Room 108 was next to room 455, which was across from room 12. When I tried to return to my room, I couldn't find it. The brass key in my hand grew hotter with each door I passed, but none of them was 237. My breathing became shallow and rapid, my chest tight with the kind of panic that makes rational thought impossible. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the persistent cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I must have made a wrong turn, I told myself. Old hotels were notorious for their confusing layouts, but as I walked, the hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step, the ceiling pressing lower, the walls closing in with such subtle persistence that I only noticed when my shoulders began to brush against them. The whispers started then, soft at first, barely audible above the hum of the radiators and the distant sound of wind. They seemed to come from behind the doors, dozens of voices murmuring in conversations I couldn't quite make out. When I pressed my ear to one of the doors, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. My hands shook as I tried door after door, the brass key scorching my palm now like a brand. None of them opened. The whispers followed me, rising and falling like waves, sometimes forming almost words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples, my vision starting to blur at the edges from hyperventilation. Then I saw him. The receptionist stood at the far end of the hall, though I was certain he hadn't been there a moment before. His too-tall frame was silhouetted against a light source I couldn't identify, and his head was tilted at that same uncomfortable angle. When he raised his hand to wave, his arm seemed to bend in too many places, like it had extra joints that shouldn't exist. I ran. My footsteps echoed off the walls in a staccato rhythm that sounded like applause, mocking and rhythmic. Behind me, I could hear other footsteps. Not the receptionists, but dozens of them, all slightly out of sync, creating a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The brass key burned in my hand like a coal from a fire, but I couldn't make myself drop it. The hallway twisted and turned, leading me past windows that showed not the storm outside but other hallways, other corridors filled with walking figures whose faces I couldn't quite see. The wallpaper was bleeding now, literally bleeding. Dark stains spreading across the patterns like water through cloth. The smell of copper and old roses filled the air, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. When I finally found a staircase, I took the steps 3 at a time, my briefcase banging against my leg with each leap. The lobby was exactly as I'd left it, down to the single amber light glowing behind the reception desk. But the receptionist was gone. The front door, however, was locked. I pulled at the handle until my palms were raw, threw my shoulder against the heavy wood until pain shot down my arm, called out for help until my voice cracked and failed. The windows were painted shut, the glass too thick to break with anything I could find. The phone behind the reception desk was dead, its receiver yielding only static when I lifted it to my ear. That's when I found the guest registry. It was open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. My name was there in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of signing it. But it wasn't the most recent entry. Below my signature, in the same handwriting, were dozens of other entries, hundreds. All in my hand, all with my name, dating back years, decades. The dates made no sense. Some were from the future, some from decades past. All signed by me, all on the same day I'd arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs as I flipped through the pages, seeing my signature repeated endlessly, the dates becoming increasingly impossible. The last entry was tomorrow's date, in handwriting that looked shaky, desperate. Please, someone has to believe me. The rooms move. The hallways change. I can't find my way out. I've been here for... The entry cut off mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into an illegible scrawl. My hands trembled as I set down the registry, my mouth dry as sand. The lobby seemed to pulse around me, the walls breathing with a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The amber light flickered, and in its dying glow, I saw them. Figures in the shadows, dozens of them, all with my face, all wearing the same expression of terror and confusion. They stood in the doorways leading to the dining room, the bar, the corridors beyond. Some looked older than me, some younger, but all unmistakably me. One was holding a briefcase identical to mine. Another clutched a brass key that glowed like an ember in the darkness. They all mouthed the same words over and over. The rooms move. The hallways change. I can't find my way out. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a hotel. It was a trap, a maze designed to catch travelers like me and fold them into its impossible geometry. How many versions of myself had walked these halls? How many had signed that registry? How many were still wandering those endless corridors, searching for a room that would always be just out of reach? But understanding the trap was the first step to escaping it. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think rationally. The hotel fed on confusion, on the panic that made people lose their way. But what if I stopped trying to find my room? What if I stopped following the rules the building wanted me to follow? I walked back to the staircase, but this time I didn't climb up. Instead, I went down into the basement I was certain hadn't existed before. The stairs were rough concrete, leading into darkness that felt absolute and heavy. My footsteps echoed differently here, as if the space was vast beyond comprehension. The basement was filled with doors, thousands of them, all numbered with impossible combinations of digits and symbols. But I ignored them all, walking straight through the maze until I found what I was looking for. A simple wooden door with no number at all. It opened onto the parking lot, where my rental car sat covered in snow but otherwise exactly as I'd left it. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that sparkled with fresh snow. The hotel loomed behind me, but when I turned to look at it, it seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. Just an old building that had seen too many years and too many guests. I didn't look back as I drove away, though I could feel its windows watching me go. In the rearview mirror, the Grandview Hotel seemed to shimmer and fade, like a mirage dissolving in desert heat. By the time I reached the main road, I couldn't see it at all. But sometimes, late at night in hotel rooms across the country, I hear whispers in the walls and see shadows that move without cause. And I know that somewhere, in a place between here and there, other versions of myself are still walking those endless halls, searching for a room they'll never find, signing a registry that will never let them leave. The brass key is still in my pocket. I've tried to throw it away dozens of times, but it always finds its way back. Sometimes I catch myself fingering its warm metal surface, and for just a moment, I remember the comfort of that terrible place, the certainty of being lost forever. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if I ever really left at all. Story 2. The forest had no business being this quiet. I'd been camping for over 20 years, from the Appalachians to the Rockies, and never once had I experienced this suffocating absence of sound. No cricket symphonies, no owl calls piercing the darkness, no rustle of small creatures scurrying through undergrowth. Even the wind had abandoned this place, leaving the towering pines motionless as cemetery monuments against the starless sky. My decision to venture into these remote woods had seemed reasonable 3 days ago. Work had been crushing me slowly, methodically, like a hydraulic press. 16-hour days, Endless meetings, the constant buzz of notifications eating away at my sanity. I needed disconnection, real disconnection, somewhere my phone couldn't reach me even if I wanted it to. The Blackwater Wilderness area had seemed perfect, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through increasingly dense forest. The ranger at the station had given me a peculiar look when I'd requested a permit for the deepest section. "Most folks stick to the outer trails," he'd said, his weathered fingers drumming against the counter. "Gets mighty isolated back there." Isolation was exactly what I'd been seeking. Now, zipped inside my tent with my camping lantern casting dancing shadows on the nylon walls, I was beginning to understand why most people avoided this area. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water pressure. I'd grown accustomed to the white noise of city life, the distant hum of traffic, the mechanical whisper of air conditioning. This absolute void of sound felt unnatural, wrong. My breathing seemed thunderous in comparison, each exhalation a violation of whatever sacred quiet gripped this place. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. The luminous digits glowed sickly green in the darkness. I'd been lying here for 2 hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally off about this stretch of forest. During daylight, I'd noticed the absence of animal signs. No deer tracks in the soft earth, no bird nests in the lower branches, no scat or fur caught on thorns. It was as if wildlife had collectively decided to avoid this particular grove. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine despite the cool mountain air. My heart was beating too fast, a rapid staccato that echoed in my ears. I tried to rationalize the anxiety. Maybe there was a gas leak from natural deposits underground. Maybe some sort of electromagnetic anomaly that affected animal behavior. There had to be a logical explanation. That's when I first saw them. Through the mesh window of my tent, barely visible in the pale starlight, stood 3 tall shapes at the edge of the clearing. They weren't trees. I'd memorized every tree line during my daylight setup. These were different, vertical, impossibly still. My mouth went dry instantly. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Lost hikers, maybe, though who would be hiking at midnight without flashlights? Park rangers on patrol. But they would have announced themselves, wouldn't they? I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty forest. Nothing but pine trunks and shadows. I swept the light back and forth across the tree line, painting arcs of yellow visibility across the black canvas of night. Nothing. I clicked off the light and immediately the shapes returned, darker silhouettes against the barely perceptible backdrop of trees. 3 of them, roughly humanoid but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too tall, perhaps 8 or 9 feet. Their proportions seemed skewed, arms hanging too long, heads tilted at unnatural angles. My breathing became shallow, rapid. Each intake felt insufficient, as if the air itself had thinned. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead and upper lip. I could taste copper in my mouth, the metallic flavor of pure fear. For what felt like hours, I watched them through the mesh window. They never moved, never shifted position. They simply stood there, patient as monuments, facing my tent. The silence around them was so complete it began to feel malevolent, as if sound itself was being actively suppressed. Gradually, imperceptibly, they drew closer. I didn't see them move. Between one blink and the next, they had advanced perhaps 10 feet toward my campsite. My pulse hammered against my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 10, opened them again. Another few feet closer. The logical mind is a fragile thing when confronted with the impossible. Mine began fracturing, generating increasingly desperate explanations. Optical illusions caused by exhaustion, hallucinations from altitude sickness, though we were only at 3,000 feet. Carbon monoxide poisoning from my camp stove, though I'd used it hours ago and well ventilated. But when I turned on the flashlight again, they vanished like smoke, leaving only ordinary forest. When I turned it off, they returned, closer still. My hands shook so violently I could barely maintain grip on the flashlight. The beam wavered crazily each time I switched it on, revealing nothing but innocent wilderness. The disconnect between what I saw with artificial light and what lurked in natural darkness was driving wedges into my sanity. By 3 a.m., they had crossed half the distance to my tent. I could make out more details now in the dim starlight. Their heads were elongated, stretched vertically like putty pulled by invisible hands. Their arms seemed to have too many joints, bending in places arms shouldn't bend. When they turned slightly, and they did turn, tracking my movements within the tent with predatory focus, I caught glimpses of their profiles. No faces that I could discern, just smooth expanses where features should have been. My sleeping bag was soaked with perspiration. Every muscle in my body was rigid with tension, cramping from hours of sustained terror. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. I'd bitten my tongue at some point and could taste blood mixing with the metallic fear in my mouth. The rational part of my mind, now barely a whisper, suggested I was having some sort of psychotic break. Stress-induced hallucinations. Maybe I should pack up, hike out in the dark, get to a hospital. But the animal part of my brain, the ancient circuitry designed to keep my ancestors alive, screamed that moving would be fatal, that these things were waiting for me to leave the imagined safety of my nylon shelter. Around 4 a.m., I heard the first sound since sunset. It wasn't quite breathing, wasn't quite whispers. A soft susurration like wind through dry leaves, except there was no wind and the leaves weren't moving. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding my tent in an acoustic cage. As it grew louder, I realized it was almost rhythmic, like chanting in a language that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. The three figures had advanced to within 20 feet of my tent. I could see them clearly now, and the clarity was worse than the uncertainty had been. They weren't wearing clothes, but their bodies weren't naked either. Their skin, if it was skin, had a texture like bark, rough and segmented. Their impossibly long arms ended in hands with too many fingers, each digit extending into what looked like thorns or claws. When they moved their heads, which they did in perfect unison, I caught glimpses of what might have been eyes. Not eyes as humans understood them, but dark hollows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Staring into those voids, I felt something fundamental inside me recoil, some base survival instinct screaming warnings in a language older than words. The susurration grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely communication of some kind, though whether they were talking to each other or to me remained unclear. The sound bypassed my ears somehow, resonating directly in my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. My body was betraying me now. My bladder had released sometime during the night, adding the humiliation of warm wetness to my catalog of terror. My hands had cramped into claws around the flashlight. When I tried to straighten my fingers, they moved like arthritic joints, stiff and painful. Dawn felt impossible, a theoretical concept that might never arrive. Time had become elastic, each minute stretching into subjective hours. I'd stopped checking my watch because the crawling progression of digital numbers was another small cruelty I couldn't bear. Then, as the eastern sky began its gradual transition from black to deep blue, something changed. The figures stopped advancing. For the first time in hours, they remained perfectly still, no longer creeping closer with their impossible, imperceptible movement. The susurration softened, became almost musical. And slowly, with the same uncanny coordination they'd maintained all night, they began to retreat. I watched them withdraw into the forest with the same impossible stealth they'd used to approach. One moment they were there, the next they had melted back into the shadows between trees. As the sky lightened further, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, they faded like nightmares before waking. The silence that had oppressed me all night suddenly broke. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, then another. The normal symphony of morning forest life began tentatively, as if the woods themselves were testing whether it was safe to resume normal function. I remained frozen in my tent until full daylight, afraid that movement might summon them back. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the entrance and step outside, I found no evidence of their presence. No footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest anything unusual had occurred. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold all over again. Around my tent, in a perfect circle perhaps 30 feet in diameter, every blade of grass had been pressed flat, not torn or damaged, but uniformly flattened as if something impossibly heavy had settled over the entire area. The boundary of this circle was precise, mathematical in its perfection. Outside the circle, the grass stood normal and undisturbed. I packed my gear with shaking hands and began the long hike out. During the 8-mile trek back to civilization, I convinced myself it had been hallucinations. Stress, exhaustion, maybe something in the water I'd filtered from the stream. By the time I reached my car, I'd almost succeeded in rationalization. That was 6 months ago. Last week I received a phone call from the Park Service. 3 more campers had reported similar experiences in the same area. Tall figures watching from the forest. Unnatural silence. Grass pressed into perfect circles around their campsites. The ranger I spoke with mentioned they were considering closing that section of the wilderness area pending investigation. When I asked what kind of investigation, he was quiet for a long moment. The kind where we try to figure out if something's living out there that shouldn't be, he finally said. I haven't been camping since. Every night when I turn off the lights in my apartment, I find myself checking the windows, searching the darkness beyond the glass for familiar silhouettes. The city noise that once irritated me now comforts me. A barrier of human sound against whatever waits in the quiet places. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I still hear that susurration. Not quite breathing, not quite whispers. And I know, with the certainty that comes from having stared into those light-absorbing voids, that they're still out there. Watching, waiting, growing bolder with each passing season, each new camper who ventures too deep into the wilderness, seeking the peace that only isolation can provide. The peace they guard with patient, inexorable hunger. Story 3. The apartment showed its age in ways that money couldn't fix. Paint peeled from the walls like diseased skin, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of secrets they'd been keeping for decades. But at $400 a month in downtown, I couldn't afford to be picky. What I couldn't have anticipated was that some places are cheap for reasons that go far beyond peeling paint and squeaky floors. The building squatted between 2 modern glass towers like a rotting tooth, its brick facade stained black with decades of urban decay. The landlord, a skeletal man with yellowed eyes, had handed me the keys with an expression that suggested he was relieved to pass along some burden. His fingers trembled slightly as he explained that the previous tenant had left suddenly, abandoning all his belongings. When I asked why, he simply shrugged and muttered something about people having different tolerances for old buildings. The first week passed quietly enough. I spent my days unpacking boxes, and my evenings familiarizing myself with the rhythms of city life 6 stories up. The building's sounds became a soundtrack I gradually learned to ignore. The elevator's mechanical wheeze, the neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls, the occasional thump of footsteps overhead. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. It was on the 8th night that I first heard them. I lay in bed, that drowsy state between waking and sleep, when a sound pulled me back to consciousness. A scratching, like fingernails against wood, coming from somewhere inside the wall beside my bed. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster and listened. The sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. My heart began its familiar rapid tattoo against my ribs as I realized the sound was too coordinated to be mice or settling wood. Too purposeful. I tapped the wall gently, and the scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had heard me and was now listening back. The silence that followed felt pregnant with attention. My mouth went dry as I waited, counting my own heartbeats. But the scratching didn't resume. I told myself it was pipes or the building's old bones stretching in the cool night air. But as I lay there staring at the water-stained ceiling, cold sweat gathering at the base of my neck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been trying to get through. Over the following nights, the sounds grew bolder. They came from different walls now, sometimes from the ceiling above my bed. Always at night, always when I was alone and vulnerable. The scratching evolved into a more complex symphony. Tapping, sliding, sometimes what sounded almost like muffled voices having urgent conversations just beyond my reach. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each incident with the desperate precision of a man trying to prove his own sanity. 11:47 p.m., scratching in bedroom wall, southeast corner. 2:23 a.m., sliding sound above kitchen, duration approximately 3 minutes. 3:15 a.m., voices, unintelligible, from bathroom wall. The entries multiplied, and with them, my growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or sharing my apartment with something that defied rational explanation. My sleep became fragmented, interrupted by my own hypervigilance. I'd lie rigid in bed, every muscle tensed, listening for the next manifestation while my nervous system flooded my bloodstream with adrenaline. During the day, I examined every inch of the walls, looking for cracks or openings that might explain the sounds. I found nothing but aging plaster and paint. The building's super, a gruff man who clearly resented being bothered, insisted there were no other tenants on my floor and no access spaces behind the walls where I'd been hearing the disturbances. As the days blended into weeks, my rational mind began to fray. I caught myself talking to the walls, demanding explanations from whatever lurked behind them. My work suffered as exhaustion accumulated like a physical weight. Colleagues commented on my appearance, suggesting I looked unwell, but how could I explain that I was afraid to sleep in my own home? The breakthrough came when I discovered Mrs. Chen in apartment 4B had lived in the building for 30 years. She was a tiny woman with intelligent eyes who invited me in for tea when I knocked on her door with my carefully prepared questions about the building's history. She told me about the previous tenant in my apartment, a man named David who had lasted only 2 months before disappearing in the middle of the night, leaving behind all his possessions and 6 months of rent paid in advance. Before David, there had been Sarah, who had vanished after 3 weeks. Before her, Miguel, gone after just 10 days. Mrs. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper as she described the pattern she'd observed over the years. People would move into apartment 6A, and for a brief period, everything would seem normal. Then would come the complaints about strange sounds, requests to the landlord for repairs that never seemed to fix anything. The tenants would become increasingly agitated, their eyes taking on the same hunted look I now recognized in my own reflection. Then they would simply disappear. Not permanently, she clarified, noting my alarm. They would be seen months or even years later, but always somewhere far away. David had been spotted in Seattle. Sarah had sent a postcard from Phoenix. Miguel had called his sister from Denver, confused and disoriented, claiming he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there or why he'd left. Mrs. Chen's theory, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had lived long enough to accept the inexplicable, was that the apartment itself was hungry, that something in those walls fed on human presence, growing stronger with each occupant until it could somehow pull them into whatever space existed between the real world and wherever the sounds originated. I left her apartment with my hands shaking and my worldview fundamentally altered. The notebook I'd been keeping suddenly seemed less like documentation of anomalies and more like a countdown to my own inevitable disappearance. That night, the sounds were different, more urgent, more coordinated. I could hear what sounded like movement throughout the entire wall system, as if a network of passages I couldn't see was suddenly alive with activity. The scratching had evolved into something that resembled digging, and underneath it all was a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into my bones. I stood in the center of my living room, turning slowly to track the sounds as they moved around me in a slow circle. The feeling of being watched, which had been growing stronger each night, now felt like a physical pressure against my skin. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I realized the sounds were no longer random. They were responding to my movements, following me around the room. The temperature in the apartment dropped noticeably. and my breath began to fog in the sudden chill. The humming grew louder, and I could feel it resonating in my chest cavity, making my heart struggle to maintain its natural rhythm. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with some alien heartbeat, and the paint began to bubble and shift as if something massive was pressing against it from behind. I backed toward the door, my legs trembling with the effort of controlled movement, when every instinct screamed at me to run. The sounds followed me, growing more insistent, more demanding. Whatever lived in those walls was no longer content to simply observe. It wanted something from me, and I could feel its hunger like a cold draft against my face. My hand found the doorknob just as the first crack appeared in the wall beside my bedroom. Not a crack in the plaster, but something deeper. A seam that hadn't existed moments before, running from floor to ceiling like the outline of a door. The edges glowed with a sickly phosphorescent light, and through the gap, I could see movement in the darkness beyond. I ran then, my nerve finally broken. I grabbed my wallet and keys and fled the apartment, leaving the door standing open behind me. In the hallway, I could hear the sound spilling out of my apartment and echoing off the walls, no longer confined to the spaces between. Other doors along the corridor remained firmly shut, but I could feel eyes watching me from behind peepholes as I stumbled toward the stairwell. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, where the normal sounds of traffic and city life crashed over me like a salvation. Looking back up at my building, I could see a strange light flickering in the windows of my apartment, and shadows moving behind the glass that were too large and too numerous to be human. 3 months later, I'm writing this from a small town 500 miles away, in a house with walls I can trust. I never went back for my belongings. The landlord's calls went unanswered until they stopped coming altogether. Mrs. Chen sent me a single letter, informing me that apartment 6A was available for rent again, and that a young woman had already inquired about viewing it. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear scratching in the walls of my new home. But I tell myself it's just mice, just the house settling, just my imagination playing tricks forged by my experience with something that should not exist. I tell myself these things, and most days, I almost believe them. But I've started keeping a new notebook, just in case. Story 4. The silence in the auction house felt different that day, heavier somehow, as if the very air held secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. Among the dusty furniture and forgotten heirlooms, one item caught my attention with an almost magnetic pull. A portrait of a man whose identity had been lost to time, his penetrating eyes staring out from beneath heavy brows with an intensity that made my chest tighten inexplicably. I should have walked away. The painting measured roughly 3 feet by 4, its ornate golden frame tarnished with age and neglect. The unknown subject wore formal attire typical of the late 19th century, his pale hands folded precisely in his lap, while those dark, unsettling eyes seemed to track my movement, even from across the crowded room. When the auctioneer's hammer fell, and I found myself the owner of this peculiar piece for a surprisingly modest sum, a chill ran down my spine that I attributed to the building's poor heating. That first night, as I hung the portrait in my living room above the fireplace, my hands trembled slightly while adjusting its position. The man's gaze bore into me with such startling clarity that I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, expecting to find someone standing behind me. His expression appeared stern, yet somehow knowing, as if he possessed information about me that I myself had forgotten. The eyes followed me. I noticed it immediately, though I told myself it was merely a trick of perspective common to well-executed portraits. Artists had mastered this illusion for centuries, painting pupils in such a way that they appeared to track observers regardless of viewing angle. Yet as I moved from the kitchen to the hallway, from the armchair to the window, those dark eyes maintained their unwavering focus on me with a persistence that made my throat constrict and my palms grow damp. Sleep came fitfully that first week. My bedroom lay directly above the living room, and throughout the night I found myself listening for sounds that never came. Footsteps on creaking floorboards, the rustle of clothing, whispered voices. Instead, an oppressive silence filled the house, broken only by my own restless tossing and the occasional groan of settling wood. When I ventured downstairs for water or to check the locks, The portrait waited in the darkness, those eyes gleaming faintly in whatever ambient light filtered through the curtains. By the second week, the changes began. Initially, I attributed the alterations to my imagination, or perhaps variations in lighting throughout the day. The man's expression seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable downward turn of the mouth. I found myself studying the painting during my morning coffee, searching for differences that I couldn't quite articulate but felt certain existed. His skin appeared paler than I remembered, almost translucent in certain light. The shadows beneath his eyes seemed deeper, darker, lending his face a gaunt quality that hadn't been present when I first acquired the piece. Most unsettling of all, his expression had begun to convey something approaching malevolence, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when this transformation had started or how it had progressed so gradually. My sleep deteriorated further. I would wake in the middle of the night with my heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool temperature I maintained in the house. The sensation of being watched pressed down on me like a physical weight, making it difficult to draw full breaths. During these midnight episodes, I resisted the urge to investigate, to creep downstairs and confront whatever was happening in my living room. But the compulsion grew stronger each night. 3 weeks after acquiring the portrait, I could no longer deny that something was fundamentally wrong. The painted figure had definitely changed, not just in expression, but in actual physical appearance. His face had grown thinner, more angular, and his once neat hair now appeared disheveled, as if he had been running his fingers through it in agitation. The formal jacket seemed looser on his frame, suggesting weight loss that should have been impossible for a painted subject. Most disturbing of all, his eyes had developed a predatory quality that made my skin crawl. They no longer simply followed my movements. They seemed to anticipate them, focusing on doorways before I entered rooms, tracking paths I intended to take before I took them. The intelligence behind those painted pupils felt active, alive, and increasingly hostile. I began avoiding the living room during daylight hours, conducting my daily activities in other parts of the house. The kitchen became my refuge, its windows facing away from the portrait's direct line of sight. Yet even there I felt observed, as if his gaze could penetrate walls and maintain its relentless surveillance. My hands shook when pouring coffee, and I found myself jumping at every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the distant rumble of traffic. Friends commented on my haggard appearance when I ventured out for groceries or work-related meetings. One colleague mentioned that I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks, which wasn't far from the truth. When they asked about my health, I deflected their concerns, knowing that any attempt to explain the situation would result in recommendations for psychiatric evaluation or suggestions that I was working too hard. How could I tell them that a painting was stalking me in my own home? The 4th week brought a new development that shattered any remaining hope that this was merely psychological stress or sleep deprivation. I had been sitting in my kitchen, back turned to the living room entrance, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on hardwood floors. They moved slowly, deliberately, with the measured pace of someone attempting stealth. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed as adrenaline flooded my system, making my vision sharper and my hearing more acute. The footsteps continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping entirely, leaving behind a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical substance. When I finally gathered enough courage to investigate, I found the living room exactly as I had left it, with one crucial exception. The portrait's head had turned slightly to the left, angling toward the doorway where I now stood. His painted eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the doorframe hard enough to leave a bruise. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my bedroom chair facing the door, listening for any sounds from below. None came, but the knowledge that something impossible was happening in my house made rest unthinkable. By morning, my nerves were frayed to the point where even shadows seemed threatening, and every creak of the house settling made me flinch violently. I researched the painting's history, spending hours online trying to trace its provenance. The auction house records provided little information beyond a vague description and an estate sale number. Phone calls to the previous owner's relatives yielded only confused responses. Apparently, the portrait had been discovered in an attic after an elderly aunt's passing, with no memory of its origin or the identity of its subject. One conversation proved particularly unsettling. The deceased woman's nephew mentioned that his aunt had complained in her final months about feeling watched in her own home. Though family members had attributed this to advancing dementia, she had reportedly insisted that something in her attic was moving around at night, making noise and rearranging items, but investigations had revealed nothing amiss. The implications made my blood run cold. During the 5th week, the portrait's transformation accelerated dramatically. The painted figure now appeared emaciated, his clothes hanging loosely on his skeletal frame. His hair had become wild and unkempt, framing a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. But most terrifying of all were his eyes. They had developed an unmistakable hunger, a predatory intensity that seemed to reach out from the canvas and wrap around my throat like invisible fingers. I began experiencing what I can only describe as waking nightmares. While going about my daily routine, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing just out of sight, always positioned where the portrait should be visible. When I turned to look directly, I found only the painting hanging innocently on the wall, though its subject's expression invariably seemed more satisfied, as if pleased by my growing distress. The sensation of being stalked intensified beyond anything I had previously experienced. Every room felt contaminated by his presence, every shadow potentially concealing his lurking form. I installed additional locks on my bedroom door and began sleeping with a baseball bat within arm's reach, though I knew such precautions were useless against whatever supernatural forces were at work. My appetite disappeared entirely. Food became tasteless, and the act of eating required tremendous effort, as my throat seemed to constrict whenever I attempted to swallow. Weight dropped off my frame with alarming speed, and I began to wonder if I was somehow absorbing the painted figure's condition, becoming thin and haggard as he grew more solid and real. The mirror in my bathroom became my enemy. Each morning, I confronted a reflection that bore an increasingly uncomfortable resemblance to the portrait subject. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under my eyes, and a haunted expression that spoke of fear so profound it had become a physical characteristic. 6 weeks after the auction, the inevitable confrontation arrived. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling, when I heard them. Footsteps climbing the stairs. They moved with deliberate slowness, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the silent house like a funeral bell. My heart rate spiked so dramatically that I thought I might be having a cardiac event, and my breathing became rapid and shallow as panic flooded my system. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, directly outside my bedroom door. I lay perfectly still, every muscle locked in terror, as the doorknob began to turn with agonizing slowness. The lock held, but the knob continued its rotation, accompanied by a sound like grinding teeth that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself. Then silence. For what felt like hours, I remained frozen in place, straining to hear any indication of movement in the hallway. When dawn finally broke and pale light filtered through my bedroom curtains, I found the courage to unlock my door and peer outside. The hallway was empty, but muddy footprints led from the stairway to my bedroom door, footprints that matched the formal shoes visible in the portrait below. That morning, I made a decision that probably saved whatever remained of my sanity. I called a local art dealer and arranged for the portrait's immediate removal and sale. When he arrived to collect the piece, he commented on its unusual qualities, mentioning that the subject seemed to be looking directly at him regardless of his position in the room. I informed him that such an effect was common in well-executed portraiture, though my voice shook as I spoke the lie. After the dealer left with the painting safely wrapped and loaded into his van, I spent the entire day cleaning my house, scrubbing away any trace of its presence. I rearranged furniture, opened every window to let in fresh air, and even considered burning sage, though I wasn't entirely sure of the proper procedure. That night, for the first time in 6 weeks, I slept peacefully. But sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, I still feel eyes watching me from empty walls, and I wonder whether some presences, once invited in, ever truly leave. The portrait may be gone, but the memory of its gaze lingers like a scar on my psyche, a reminder that some mysteries are better left undisturbed, and some auctions are best avoided entirely. The dealer never contacted me about finding a buyer, and I never asked. Story 5. The static crackled like fire consuming dry wood, and through its white noise, something whispered my name. I found the radio buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten memories in Henderson's Antiques, a cramped shop that smelled of mothballs and decay. The proprietor, a weathered man with trembling hands, seemed eager to be rid of it. He mentioned something about the previous owner's sudden departure from town, but his words were garbled, rushed. I paid $20 for what appeared to be a 1940s Philco, its wooden cabinet scarred and its chrome fixtures tarnished black. My workshop in the basement became a sanctuary of sorts. The concrete walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a cocoon of silence broken only by the gentle hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional scratch of my tools against metal. Restoring old electronics had become my escape from the suffocating routine of my office job, a meditative process that required patience and precision. The radio's internals were a maze of vacuum tubes and capacitors, many corroded beyond recognition. I spent weeks sourcing replacement parts, meticulously cleaning connections, rewiring circuits that had been damaged by decades of neglect. My fingers grew intimate with every component, every wire, every resistor. The work consumed my evenings and weekends, providing blessed distraction from the monotony that had settled over my life like a shroud. When I finally connected the power cord and heard the first spark of electricity coursing through the restored circuits, my chest swelled with pride. The dial glowed amber in the dimly lit basement, casting strange shadows on the concrete walls. I turned the tuning knob slowly, listening to the symphony of static and interference that filled the airwaves. At first, the transmission seemed ordinary enough. Local news stations, talk radio, fragments of music bleeding through from distant frequencies. But as the days passed, I began noticing something unsettling about certain broadcasts. Voices would emerge from the static, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about events that hadn't yet occurred. The first prediction came during a late Tuesday evening session. A woman's voice, distorted and crackling through layers of interference, described a 3-car collision at the intersection of Maple and 5th Street. She provided specific details: a blue sedan running a red light, a delivery truck swerving to avoid impact, the sound of grinding metal and shattering glass. I dismissed it as coincidence when I heard the same accident reported on the morning news the following day. But the predictions continued with disturbing regularity. A man's voice, thick with an accent I couldn't place, spoke about a warehouse fire on the industrial side of town. He described the orange flames licking at broken windows, the acrid smell of burning chemicals, the wail of sirens cutting through the night air. 2 days later, the local newspaper's front page featured a photograph that matched his description exactly. My hands began to tremble whenever I approached the radio. The basement, once my refuge, now felt oppressive. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows that appeared to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. I found myself checking the locks on my basement door multiple times each evening, though I couldn't explain why. The voices grew more frequent, more urgent. They spoke of minor accidents, small fires, petty crimes, domestic disputes. Nothing catastrophic, but always accurate, always true. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each prediction, comparing them to subsequent news reports. The correlation was perfect, undeniable. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the distorted voices in my mind. Their words carried in quality that burrowed deep into my consciousness, leaving me restless and anxious. Dark circles formed beneath my eyes, and my colleagues at work began commenting on my haggard appearance. 3 weeks after the first prediction, I decided to test the radio's power. I waited until the voices emerged from the static, then quickly turned the power switch off. The amber glow faded. The circuits went silent, But the voices continued. They became louder, more insistent, speaking over one another in a cacophony of overlapping predictions. My heart hammered against my ribs as I yanked the power cord from the wall. The radio should have been completely dead, yet the voices persisted. They described a purse snatching in Riverside Park, a kitchen fire on Elm Street, a fender bender outside the post office. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sounds seemed to emanate from inside my skull. When I finally worked up the courage to check the next day's news, every prediction had come true. I considered destroying the radio, smashing it with a hammer, but something held me back. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps some darker compulsion that I didn't want to acknowledge. Instead, I moved it to the far corner of the basement, unplugged and covered with an old blanket. But the voices found me anyway. They whispered to me during meetings at work, their words threading through conversations with colleagues. They murmured from empty rooms in my house, their predictions echoing from air vents and heating ducts. I would catch fragments of their forecasts while washing dishes, while reading the newspaper, while trying to watch television. The boundary between the radio's influence and my own thoughts began to blur. I found myself anticipating the predictions, sometimes speaking them aloud before the voices had even begun. When I realized what was happening, my throat constricted with terror, my mouth went dry, my palms slicked with cold sweat. 4 weeks in, the predictions began to change. They became more personal, more specific to my own life. A voice described my morning routine with unsettling accuracy. The time I would wake, the number of steps from my bedroom to the kitchen, the contents of my breakfast. Another voice predicted the exact words my supervisor would use during our weekly meeting. I stopped going to work. I called in sick, claiming a bout of flu, but the truth was more complicated. I couldn't bear the thought of confirming another prediction, of watching reality conform to the radio's twisted prophecies. Instead, I barricaded myself in my house, disconnecting the basement radio and storing it in the garage. But the voices followed me. They emerged from my television speakers, from my computer, from the radio in my car. They predicted which neighbors would walk past my window, which delivery trucks would rumble down my street, which birds would perch on my fence. The specificity was maddening, the accuracy absolute. My reflection in mirrors began to look foreign, gaunt and hollow-eyed. I lost weight without trying, my appetite destroyed by the constant anxiety that gnawed at my stomach. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams where distorted voices narrated my every movement. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. I was sitting in my living room, trying to read a book, when a child's voice began speaking from the kitchen radio. The voice was different from the others, clearer, more immediate. It described me walking to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, reaching for a carton of milk. As it spoke, I felt my body moving involuntarily, my legs carrying me toward the kitchen against my conscious will. I fought against the compulsion, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles, my muscles straining against some invisible force. The child's voice became more insistent, describing how I would pour the milk into a glass, how I would drink it slowly while staring out the window at my neighbor's house. My hand reached for the refrigerator handle, trembling with the effort of resistance. In that moment, I understood the true horror of my situation. The radio wasn't just predicting the future, it was controlling it. The voices weren't describing events that would happen. They were commanding events to happen. And somehow, I had become part of their broadcast network. I stumbled back to the garage, yanking the covered radio from its hiding place. My fingers shook as I plugged it back in, and immediately the basement filled with overlapping voices, dozens of them speaking simultaneously. They described my fear, my trembling hands, my racing heartbeat. They narrated my every breath, my every blink, my every thought. But beneath their cacophony, I heard something else. Laughter. Not human laughter, but something older, more primal. Something that had been waiting for decades in the circuits and vacuum tubes, feeding on the predictions, growing stronger with each confirmed prophecy. I realized then that the radio had never been broken. It had been hungry. The voices reached a crescendo, describing how I would smash the radio with a crowbar, how the circuits would spark and smoke, how the voices would finally fall silent. But as I raised the tool above my head, they began describing something else, how the destruction would only transfer their power to the next antique radio, the next unsuspecting hobbyist, the next victim who would find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of predicted events. My arms froze mid-swing. The voices described my hesitation, my growing understanding, my dawning horror at the realization that I could never truly destroy what had taken hold of me. In the end, I didn't smash the radio. Instead, I unplugged it one final time and carried it back to Henderson's Antiques. The weathered proprietor looked unsurprised to see me, though I noticed his hands trembled more violently than before. He accepted the radio without comment, placing it back in the dusty corner where I had found it. As I left the shop, I heard him speaking to another customer about a beautiful vintage Philco, perfect for restoration. The customer, a young woman with eager eyes and steady hands, seemed genuinely interested. I wanted to warn her, to tell her about the voices and the predictions and the terrible hunger that lived in those circuits. But when I opened my mouth to speak, I heard my own voice describing how I would remain silent, how I would walk away, how I would become complicit in the cycle that had nearly consumed me. The prediction came true, as they always did. Now, months later, I still hear the voices sometimes. They whisper from radios in stores, from speakers in restaurants, from televisions in waiting rooms. They're quieter now, more distant, but they're always there. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, they describe events that haven't happened yet. Events that I know, with absolute certainty, will come true. Story 6. The storm had teeth and it was hungry for me. Rain lashed against my windshield like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside, each droplet exploding in a burst of refracted lightning that made the world outside flicker between existence and void. My car's headlights carved feeble tunnels through the darkness, illuminating nothing but sheets of water and the occasional twisted silhouette of a tree bent nearly horizontal by the wind. The radio had died an hour ago, leaving me alone with the symphony of the storm and the increasingly erratic rhythm of my own heartbeat. I should have stayed at the motel, should have ignored the deadline breathing down my neck like a predator, should have listened to the clerk's warnings about the back roads during storm season. But desperation makes fools of us all, and I was running late for the most important presentation of my career. The shortcut through the rural countryside had seemed logical 6 hours ago, when the sky was merely overcast and my GPS cheerfully promised to shave 40 minutes off my drive. Now, as thunder rolled overhead like the footsteps of giants, I realized I hadn't seen another car or any sign of civilization for the past 2 hours. My phone showed no signal naturally. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty, and my headlights revealed nothing but an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the storm's maw. That's when I saw the house. It materialized from the darkness like something dredged up from the depths of a fever dream. A Victorian monstrosity perched on a low hill, its gabled roof and ornate trim stark against the roiling clouds. Warm yellow light spilled from several windows, creating pools of false comfort in the hostile night. My hands, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, actually relaxed slightly. Shelter, warmth, perhaps a phone line that still worked. I pulled into the gravel driveway, stones crunching under my tires like small bones. The engine's death rattle was immediately swallowed by the storm's fury. Rain hammered the roof of my car with such violence that I hesitated before opening the door. When I finally made the sprint to the covered porch, I was soaked through in seconds, my suit clinging to my body like a second skin, cold water running down my spine in rivulets that made me shudder. The front door was heavy wood, dark with age and moisture. A brass knocker in the shape of a gargoyle's head leered at me, its green patina catching the light from the porch lamp. I raised my hand to knock, then noticed the door was already slightly ajar, darkness visible through the crack like a thin smile. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open wider. My voice was nearly lost in the storm's roar. "Is anyone home?" I need help. My car. The words died in my throat as warmth enveloped me, carrying with it the musty scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that made my nostrils flare. I stepped inside, my waterlogged shoes squelching against what felt like expensive hardwood. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden relative quiet. I found myself in a grand foyer, illuminated by an ornate chandelier that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with dark wood paneling. A sweeping staircase curved upward into gloom, its banister worn smooth by countless hands. But it was the paintings that immediately commanded my attention. They covered every available wall space, dozens of them in elaborate frames that glinted dully in the uncertain light. Most were portraits, men and women in period dress staring out with eyes that seemed to track my movement across the room. Their faces held expressions I couldn't quite decipher, as if they were all sharing some private joke at my expense. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. The sound echoed strangely, as if the house were much larger than it appeared from outside. Water dripped from my clothes onto the floor, each drop marking time like a metronome. "I'm sorry to intrude, but my car broke down in the storm. I just need to use your phone." Silence answered me, broken only by the muffled fury of the storm outside and the steady drip of my sodden clothes. I waited, listening for footsteps or voices, but heard nothing. The house felt empty, abandoned, despite the lights that had drawn me in from the darkness. My eyes wandered back to the paintings, and that's when I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, hanging directly across from the entrance, was a portrait that looked disturbingly familiar. The face, angular, with brown hair and tired eyes, bore an uncomfortable resemblance to my own. The clothing was different, older, but the features... I stepped closer, my heart beginning to beat faster. The man in the painting wore a look of barely contained panic, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-scream. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with terror, and his hands were pressed against what appeared to be glass, fingers splayed in desperate futility. A coincidence? It had to be. People often resembled strangers, especially in the flickering uncertainty of artificial light. I forced myself to look away, to focus on finding a phone or the house's owner. My shoes left wet prints across the floor as I moved deeper into the house, each step announcing my presence to the empty rooms. The hallway beyond the foyer stretched in both directions, punctuated by doorways that gaped like mouths in the dim light. I chose the left passage, partly because I thought I heard the faint hum of electrical appliances from that direction, partly because the right corridor felt somehow colder, more unwelcoming. The first room I entered appeared to be a study or library. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes whose titles I couldn't make out in the uncertain light. A massive desk dominated the center of the space, its surface clear except for an old-fashioned telephone that made my heart leap with hope. I hurried to the desk and lifted the receiver, pressing it to my ear. Silence. Not even a dial tone. I jiggled the switch hook several times, but the line remained dead. Of course, the storm had probably knocked out power and phone lines for miles around. It was then, as I replaced the receiver with mounting frustration, that I noticed the painting hanging above the desk. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was me again. Unmistakably me, but different from the first portrait. In this one, I was standing in what looked like this very study, one hand reaching for the telephone while my head was turned toward the painting itself, face frozen in an expression of dawning horror. The artist had captured the exact moment of recognition, the precise instant when reality began to fracture around the edges. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. This was impossible. These paintings couldn't exist. I'd never been in this house before tonight, never posed for any portraits. Yet the evidence hung before me, rendered in oil paint with photographic accuracy. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the house, the sound sharp and deliberate in the silence. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but saw nothing except shadows dancing in the doorway. The storm raged on outside, but suddenly the house itself felt like the greater threat. I needed to leave. Now. My car might be nearly out of gas, but I could coast to the nearest town, find help elsewhere. Anywhere but here, in this impossible place where my face stared down at me from canvases that shouldn't exist. But as I moved toward the study door, my eyes caught another painting I'd somehow missed before. This one showed me walking down the very hallway I'd just traversed, water still dripping from my clothes, but my expression was different. Where moments ago I'd felt merely lost and anxious, the painted version of myself looked terrified, glancing over my shoulder as if something were following just outside the frame. My breath came in short, sharp gasps now, each inhalation seeming to provide less oxygen than the last. The metallic taste I'd noticed upon entering grew stronger, coating my tongue with its unpleasant tang. I realized it was the taste of my own fear, as if terror had a flavor and I was drowning in it. I stumbled from the study, no longer caring about stealth or politeness. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching away from me like something from a funhouse mirror. More paintings lined the walls, and though I tried not to look at them, my eyes were drawn to each one like iron filings to a magnet. There I was, climbing the staircase in the foyer, my face pale with exhaustion and fear. There I was again, standing in what appeared to be a kitchen, frantically yanking at a door that refused to open. And there, in a frame that made my knees buckle, was myself curled in a corner of a small room, hands covering my face, body shaking with what could only be complete psychological breakdown. The paintings weren't just showing me in this house. They were showing me trapped in this house, growing progressively more desperate and unhinged. They were telling a story, frame by frame, of my complete descent into madness. I ran then, abandoning any pretense of calm. My feet slipped on the wet floor, and I nearly fell twice before reaching the foyer. The front door stood before me like salvation itself, dark wood promising escape from this nightmare gallery. I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing. I pulled harder, throwing my full weight into it, but the door remained firmly shut. There was no lock visible on my side, no deadbolt or security chain, but the door might as well have been welded into place. I braced my foot against the frame and heaved until my shoulders burned, but it wouldn't budge. A window. I'd break a window if I had to. Glass could be replaced. My sanity might not be so easily repaired. I ran to the nearest window, grabbing a small bronze statue from a side table to use as a makeshift hammer. The statue was heavier than expected, and I nearly dropped it before hefting it above my head. The bronze struck the glass with a ringing impact that should have sent shards flying. Instead, the window remained perfectly intact, not even a crack marring its surface. I hit it again, putting every ounce of strength I possessed into the blow. The statue bounced off as if the glass were made of diamond. Behind me, another floorboard creaked. I turned slowly, statue still clutched in my white-knuckled fists, and saw something that made my vision blur around the edges. The paintings had changed. Where before they'd shown me in various states of distress throughout the house, now they all depicted the same scene. Myself, standing in this very foyer, holding the bronze statue, staring up at the walls with an expression of absolute, soul-destroying terror. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in every single painting, something else occupied the foyer with me. A shape that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, but was nonetheless there in each frame, growing larger and more defined as my eyes moved from portrait to portrait. It stood behind me in the paintings, just out of reach, a darkness that seemed to bend light around itself. In some frames, it appeared almost human. In others, it was something else entirely, something that my mind refused to fully process. But in every single painting, its attention was focused entirely on me, and I could feel it now, in the real foyer, standing behind me just as it appeared in the oil and canvas prophecies surrounding me. The air grew colder against my back, and the metallic taste in my mouth intensified until I thought I might vomit. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever lurked behind me, but a deeper, more primal voice whispered that some things were better left unseen. The paintings began to shift again, imperceptibly at first, then with increasing speed. The The scenes changed like frames in a movie reel, showing my immediate future in accelerating succession. In one, I was running up the staircase. In another, I was throwing myself against an upstairs window, then hammering on a locked bedroom door, then collapsed on the floor, consciousness finally abandoning me to whatever fate awaited. But the final painting, the one that made my bladder nearly release and my heart skip several beats, showed me standing exactly where I was now, in this foyer, but months or perhaps years later. My clothes were different, torn and dirty, and my face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, marked by the passage of time and the erosion of hope. Most horrifying of all, I was smiling in that final portrait, a vacant, broken expression that suggested my mind had finally snapped under the weight of endless, inescapable repetition. The thing behind me moved closer. I could feel its presence like a physical weight, pressing against my spine with cold that went deeper than temperature. My breath came out in visible puffs now, though the house had been warm when I entered. The bronze statue fell from my nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like a death knell. I understood then, with terrible clarity, what this place was. Not a house at all, but a trap. A temporal snare that fed on confusion and despair, growing stronger with each loop, each repetition of the same futile struggle. The paintings weren't predicting my future. They were showing me my past, over and over again. An endless cycle of arrival, discovery, terror, and ultimately, acceptance. How many times had I stood in this spot? How many iterations of myself had stared up at these same walls, seen these same impossible portraits, felt this same cold presence breathing down their necks? The portraits suggested dozens, perhaps hundreds of repetitions, each one wearing down my resistance a little more, each one bringing me closer to the broken smile of that final painting. The presence behind me spoke then, not with words, but with a voice that bypassed my ears entirely and whispered directly into my consciousness. It told me truths I didn't want to hear, showed me visions of myself growing old in these rooms, growing mad in these corridors, eventually growing content in this beautiful prison. It promised me that the terror would fade, that acceptance would come, that I would learn to appreciate the artistry of my own entrapment. But I also understood something else, something the presence didn't expect me to grasp. The paintings showed loops, repetitions, but they also showed slight variations. In some iterations, I lasted longer before breaking. In others, I found different hiding places, different escape attempts. The trap wasn't perfect. It was learning, adapting, but that meant it could be fought. I had to change the pattern, had to do something none of my previous selves had done, something that would break the cycle rather than perpetuate it. With tremendous effort, I forced myself to look away from the paintings, to ignore the cold presence at my back, and focus on the one thing that remained constant in every portrait, my own terror. In every frame I was afraid. In every iteration, I was fighting the house, fighting the presence, fighting the inevitable. What if I stopped fighting? The idea was counter to every survival instinct I possessed, but it was also the one variable that hadn't been tested. Every painting showed struggle, resistance, fear. None showed acceptance. Not until that final broken portrait that might be years in the future. I closed my eyes and let my shoulders relax. The cold presence pressed closer, confused by my sudden stillness. I could feel its attention intensifying, probing, trying to understand this deviation from the established pattern. "I'm not afraid," I said aloud, though my voice shook with the lie. "I'm not fighting anymore." The presence recoiled slightly, and for the first time since entering the house, I felt a flicker of hope. The paintings on the walls began to shift again, faster now, cycling through possibilities like a computer processing new variables. Some showed me continuing to stand motionless. Others depicted me walking calmly through the house, no longer fleeing or struggling. But one painting, previously hidden behind others, began to emerge at the far end of the foyer. In it, I was walking out the front door, step by step, neither running nor cowering, simply leaving. The presence behind me was still there, but it was no longer pursuing. It was watching, perhaps even learning something new about the nature of fear and acceptance. I opened my eyes and walked toward the front door with measured steps. My heart still raced, my palms still sweated, but I kept my breathing steady and my pace even. The door handle turned smoothly under my grip. Outside, the storm was breaking. Lightning still flickered in the distance, but the rain had gentled to a steady drizzle. My car waited in the driveway, and when I turned the key, the engine caught immediately. The fuel gauge still read nearly empty, but somehow I knew it would be enough to reach civilization. As I pulled away from the house, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The Victorian mansion stood silhouetted against the clearing sky, light still burning in its windows. And there, barely visible in the doorway, was a dark shape that might have been a person, or might have been something else entirely, watching my departure with what I could only interpret as curiosity. I never found out if the paintings predicted only one possible future, or if they simply showed the most likely outcomes based on human nature and fear. I never returned to that stretch of road, never tried to find the house again. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, I wonder if somewhere in that temporal gallery, there hangs a portrait of an empty foyer, waiting patiently for the next traveler to seek shelter from the storm. And I wonder if the next visitor will have the wisdom to stop fighting long enough to simply walk away. Story 7. The mist never lifted. Not once in the 3 weeks I'd been there, not even during the supposed peak of afternoon sun. It clung to the property like a living thing, writhing between fence posts and coiling around the weathered barn with an almost deliberate persistence that made my skin crawl every time I stepped outside. I accepted the caretaking job out of desperation more than anything else. My distant uncle's estate needed someone to maintain the property for a month while probate sorted through his affairs. The pay was decent, the isolation appealing after my recent divorce, and frankly, I needed to get away from everything familiar. What I hadn't expected was to find myself trapped in what felt like a pocket dimension, where natural laws seemed suspended. The farmhouse sat at the center of roughly 40 acres, surrounded by overgrown fields that disappeared into the perpetual gray haze. During my first morning, I'd attempted to walk the property boundaries, but gave up after an hour of stumbling through the thick, damp air that seemed to muffle sound and distort distance. The mist wasn't just visual, it had weight, pressing against my chest with each breath, coating my throat with its metallic taste. My pulse quickened whenever I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first I dismissed these glimpses as tricks of light filtering through the vapor, or perhaps deer moving through the tall grass. But as days passed, the shapes became more frequent, more deliberate. They appeared just beyond the edge of clarity, dark silhouettes that seemed to pause when I turned toward them, only to dissolve back into the gray when I focused directly. The sensation of being watched began during my second week. It started as a prickle between my shoulder blades while I repaired loose boards on the front porch. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the hammer, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling intensified when I worked outside, as if multiple sets of eyes tracked my every movement from within the concealing mist. Sleep became elusive. The old farmhouse creaked and settled throughout the night, but underneath those familiar sounds, I began to detect others. Soft footsteps circling the property, the whisper of movement through tall grass, sometimes what sounded like breathing just outside my bedroom window. My heart would slam against my ribs as I lay rigid in bed, straining to identify each noise while sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. By the third week, the shapes in the mist had grown bolder. I could make out human-like forms standing motionless in the fields, visible for longer periods before fading. They appeared to be wearing tattered clothing that hung loose on gaunt frames, The distance made details impossible to discern, but something about their posture, the way they tilted their heads, the unnatural stillness of their stance, sent ice water through my veins. My hands shook as I prepared simple meals, the constant state of alert exhaustion wearing down my nerves. The isolation compounded everything. No cell service reached the property, and the landline had been disconnected months ago. My pickup truck remained my only connection to the outside world, but leaving felt like abandoning a post I'd committed to maintain. The first direct encounter happened on a Tuesday evening. I was closing the chicken coop when movement caught my eye near the old grain silo. A figure stood perhaps 30 yards away, clearer than any I'd seen before. Tall, impossibly thin, with what appeared to be long hair hanging over its face. My mouth went dry as sand. The figure remained perfectly still for several seconds while my pulse hammered in my ears, then began walking toward me with a strange gliding gait. Terror locked my muscles. I wanted to run, to call out, to do something, but found myself frozen as the shape approached through the mist. 20 yards. 15. Close enough now to see that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps. At 10 yards, it stopped abruptly and cocked its head to one side, studying me with an intensity I could feel despite being unable to see its features clearly. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a feed bucket, and in that moment of broken eye contact, the figure vanished. Not faded. Vanished. One instant it was there. The next, nothing but swirling mist where it had stood. That night I dragged the heaviest dresser I could find against my bedroom door and wedged a chair under the handle. Sleep came in fractured pieces between jolts of awakened terror as sounds circled the house, scraping against the siding, tapping on windows, the soft thud of footsteps on the front porch. The fourth week brought escalation. Multiple figures now appeared simultaneously, forming a loose circle around the farmhouse at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. They maintained their positions from dusk until dawn, shifting occasionally but never approaching closer. During daylight hours, they retreated deeper into the mist but never disappeared entirely. I caught glimpses of them watching from the tree line, patient and persistent. My nerves frayed further with each passing hour. Simple tasks became monumental efforts as paranoia consumed my thoughts. Had that shadow moved while I wasn't looking? Was something standing behind the barn? The constant hypervigilance exhausted me, leaving my hands unsteady and my thoughts scattered. Food lost all taste. My stomach remained knotted with anxiety, rejecting most attempts at nourishment. Sleep deprivation made everything worse. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more sharp, and the boundary between reality and hallucination began to blur. I started talking to myself, just to hear a human voice in the oppressive silence. On Thursday night, they moved closer. The circle tightened to perhaps 20 yards from the house. Through my bedroom window, I could make out more details of their forms. Some appeared to be missing limbs. Others moved with jerky, unnatural motions. All maintained that same terrible stillness when not shifting positions, like mannequins waiting for some signal to spring into action. My hands trembled violently as I gripped the window frame, breath fogging the glass in rapid puffs. The figures seemed to sense my observation because several turned toward my window in unison. Their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. Though I couldn't see their faces clearly through the mist and darkness, I felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. Friday brought the closest encounter yet. While gathering eggs from the coop in late afternoon, I found myself surrounded, not aggressively. The figures maintained their distance, but definitively encircled. They stood motionless in the mist, perhaps a dozen of them, creating a living barrier between me and the farmhouse. My heart raced so fast I feared it might burst. Sweat poured down my back despite the cool air. For several minutes I remained frozen beside the coop, clutching the egg basket while they watched. Then, slowly, carefully, I began walking toward the house. The figures parted as I approached, creating a narrow corridor but maintaining their presence on either side. The walk to the front door felt endless. I could sense them just beyond my peripheral vision. close enough to touch if they chose to reach out. My legs felt weak, barely supporting my weight. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue. At the porch steps, I fought the urge to run the final distance. Instead, I maintained the slow, measured pace until I reached the door, then slipped inside and immediately threw the deadbolt. Through the kitchen window, I watched them resume their circle, tighter now than ever before. That night, I made my decision. 3 more days remained on my commitment, but my sanity couldn't withstand the escalating pressure. I packed my belongings by lamplight, hands shaking as I folded clothes and gathered personal items. The sounds outside intensified. Footsteps on the roof, scratching at the walls. What sounded like whispered conversations just beyond the door. Dawn broke gray and muted as always. The figures had withdrawn slightly, though they remained visible in the mist surrounding the property. I loaded my truck quickly, every nerve on high alert. The engine turned over on the first try, a small mercy that nearly brought tears of relief. As I drove down the gravel road toward the main highway, I watched the farmhouse recede in my rearview mirror. The mist seemed to pulse with hidden movement, dark shapes shifting within its depths. At the property gate, I stopped and looked back one final time. The figures had emerged from the mist, standing in a perfect line along the fence. Dozens of them now, far more than I'd ever seen simultaneously. They watched my departure with that same terrible stillness, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of something that might have been faces beneath the long hanging hair. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back again. Later, much later, after I'd returned to civilization and attempted to resume normal life, I called the estate lawyer handling my uncle's affairs. The conversation was brief but illuminating. He mentioned almost casually that the property had been in the family for generations, that several caretakers over the years had left suddenly, usually around the 3-week mark. That local folklore spoke of the land being cursed, though he dismissed such talk as rural superstition. I never asked what happened to those who stayed the full month. The nightmares began a week after I left. In them, I'm back at the farmhouse, but this time, I don't have the truck. The mist presses closer each night, and the figures grow bolder, more insistent. They want something from me, something I cannot understand or provide. I wake with my heart pounding and the taste of metal in my mouth, convinced I can smell that damp, clinging mist in my bedroom. Sometimes, on particularly foggy mornings in my new apartment, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes that dissolve when I turn to look. And I wonder if leaving was really escape, or if I've simply carried something back with me from that shrouded farm where the mist never lifts and the watchers never rest. Story 8. Something was fundamentally wrong with the darkness that night. It pressed against my windshield like a living thing, thick and suffocating, swallowing the weak beams of my headlights before they could penetrate more than a few yards ahead. The kind of darkness that makes you question whether the world beyond your immediate vision still exists, or if you've somehow driven off the edge of reality itself. I should have taken the highway. I should have listened to my gut when it twisted with unease as I turned onto this forgotten stretch of asphalt that carved through endless pine forests. But the GPS had been insistent, its calm female voice directing me down increasingly narrow roads, promising this route would save me 40 minutes on my drive home from the conference. Now, 3 hours past my expected arrival time, I was beginning to understand that some shortcuts lead nowhere good. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, the leather slick with perspiration that seemed to seep from every pore. The air conditioning wasn't working properly, or maybe it was, and this cold sweat coating my skin had nothing to do with temperature. My heart hammered against my ribs with the irregular rhythm of a broken metronome, each beat sending fresh waves of adrenaline through my system that left me feeling simultaneously hyper-alert and exhausted. The GPS screen glowed blue in the darkness, its cheerful interface showing a route that made no sense. According to the device, I was traveling in a perfect circle, a loop that brought me past the same landmarks every 23 minutes. A rusted mailbox tilted at an impossible angle, a dead oak tree split down the middle by lightning, its charred branches reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers. A reflective road sign peppered with bullet holes that caught my headlights and threw the light back at me in scattered fragments. I had tried to convince myself it was a glitch, that the satellite signal was weak in these remote woods, and the device was simply confused. But the mailbox was there, exactly where it should be. The lightning-struck oak stood sentinel in the same spot. The bullet-riddled sign reflected my lights with the same scattered pattern, and I found myself counting the holes, 17 of them, arranged in a constellation that seemed to burn itself into my retinas. The first time I noticed the figure, I almost dismissed it as a trick of shadows and wishful thinking. Just a dark shape standing at the edge of the road, barely visible in my peripheral vision as I passed. My mind, desperate for any sign of human life in this desolate stretch, might have conjured it from the interplay of headlight beams and tree trunks. But when I completed the circuit again and saw it in the exact same spot, my throat constricted until swallowing became a conscious effort. It stood perfectly still beside the lightning-struck oak, a hooded silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and the hood cast such deep shadows over its face that I couldn't make out any features. It didn't move as I passed, didn't turn to follow my progress or acknowledge my presence in any way. It simply stood there, watching, or waiting, or existing in a way that made my spine crawl with primitive terror. My foot found the brake pedal, and I slowed to a crawl, rolling down the passenger window despite every instinct screaming at me to accelerate. The night air that rushed in carried scents of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my nostrils burn. I called out to the figure, my voice cracking like an adolescent's, asking if they needed help or directions. The words disappeared into the darkness without echo, swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded this place. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. I pressed the accelerator and continued around the loop, my hands shaking so violently that the steering wheel vibrated. The GPS recalculated with its usual chime, showing the same impossible circular route. 23 minutes later, I passed the figure again. This time I kept my windows rolled up and my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I could feel its presence boring into me like a physical weight. By the fifth loop, panic had settled into my bones like arthritis. My shirt clung to my back with sweat, and I had bitten my lower lip so hard I could taste copper. I tried everything I could think of, turning off the GPS and following the road signs, stopping to turn around and drive in the opposite direction, even pulling over to examine the road for any turnoffs I might have missed. But the signs all pointed in directions that led back to the loop. Driving in reverse simply brought me to the same landmarks in reverse order, and there were no side roads to be found. The forest pressed in on both sides like green walls, impenetrable and uniform. The figure appeared earlier on the sixth loop, standing not beside the oak tree but closer to the road, positioned near the tilted mailbox. In the brief moment my headlights illuminated it, I thought I saw something that might have been a face within the hood, pale and gaunt, with dark hollows where eyes should be. But when I blinked and looked again, there was only shadow. My breathing had become ragged and shallow, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. The car felt like a cage hurtling through a nightmare landscape that obeyed no natural laws. Time seemed elastic here, stretching and compressing in ways that made me question whether minutes or hours were passing. My phone showed no signal, its screen casting sickly green light over my increasingly pale features. The clock read 11:47 p.m., but I could swear it had shown the same time for the last 3 loops. On the 7th circuit, the figure stood in the middle of the road. I saw it from a distance, a dark obstruction that shouldn't be there, and my foot instinctively moved toward the brake. But something, some primal survival instinct, kept me from stopping completely. I slowed to a crawl and watched through the windshield as the hooded shape stood motionless in my path, arms hanging loose at its sides, face lost in the depths of its cowl. As I drew closer, I could see that it was even taller than I had thought, impossibly elongated as if someone had stretched a human form beyond its natural proportions. The robe or cloak it wore seemed to ripple and shift in ways that had nothing to do with any breeze, moving with a life of its own. My headlights passed through it rather than illuminating it, as if it existed in some space adjacent to reality. I drove straight toward it, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, sweat stinging my eyes, heart threatening to burst from my chest. At the last moment, when collision seemed inevitable, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. No movement, no stepping aside, no fading away. One moment it blocked my path. The next moment the road stretched empty ahead of me. But I could see it in my rearview mirror, standing in the exact center of the yellow line, watching my taillights disappear into the darkness. The eighth loop brought a new horror. The figure wasn't alone anymore. Two shapes stood by the roadside now, perfectly identical in their impossible height and shadow-dark robes. They flanked the lightning-struck oak like sentries, motionless and patient. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to complete this circuit quickly, but the speedometer needle remained fixed at 35 miles per hour no matter how far I pushed the pedal toward the floor. More figures appeared with each loop. By the 10th circuit, they lined both sides of the road like a grotesque honor guard. Their hooded faces turned toward my car as I passed. I stopped counting them after 20, my mind recoiling from the mathematics of multiplication that would be required. They stood at perfectly measured intervals, each one identical to the last, each one radiating that same sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. The air inside the car had grown thick and stifling, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. Every breath felt like drowning in reverse, drawing in atmosphere that seemed too heavy for my lungs to process. My vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing in my peripheral vision like living shadows. I wondered if I was hyperventilating, if panic was finally claiming my sanity, if this was how people broke down when faced with impossible circumstances. But the GPS continued its cheerful recalculations. The landmarks appeared exactly where they belonged, and the speedometer held steady at 35 miles per hour. If this was madness, it was madness with internal consistency. On what I thought might be the 15th loop, though time had become meaningless in this place, I noticed that the figures had begun to move, not walking or turning, but simply existing in slightly different positions than before. One that had stood beside the mailbox now stood 3 feet closer to the road. Another had rotated slightly, its hidden face tracking my progress with mechanical precision. The changes were subtle but undeniable, like frames in a stop-motion animation played back at an almost imperceptible speed. They were closing in. My hands trembled so violently that I could barely maintain my grip on the steering wheel. Sweat poured down my face in rivulets, stinging my eyes and leaving salt tracks on my cheeks. Every muscle in my body had contracted into a state of permanent tension, as if my entire being was prepared to flee but had nowhere to run. The car had become both sanctuary and prison, protecting me from the figures while trapping me in their domain. I tried screaming, a raw, animal sound that tore at my throat and filled the car with desperate noise. But even my own voice seemed muffled here, dampened by whatever unnatural laws governed this stretch of road. The scream died away into silence, leaving only the steady hum of the engine and the soft chime of the GPS recalculating. It was during the 20th loop that I finally understood. The figures hadn't been watching me. They had been waiting for me. This entire nightmare, the endless circuit, the impossible geography, the growing congregation of hooded shapes, wasn't random. It was orchestrated, planned. I had been guided here, lured down progressively narrower roads by a GPS that was either compromised or never real to begin with. But understanding didn't bring relief. If anything, the knowledge that this was intentional made everything worse. Someone or something had wanted me here, had engineered this elaborate trap for reasons I couldn't fathom. The questions multiplied in my mind like malignant cells. How many others had been led here? How long had this been happening? What was the purpose of gathering victims, assuming that's what I was, in this impossible loop? The figures now stood so close to the road that I could almost reach out and touch them as I passed. In the brief moments when my headlights swept across them, I caught glimpses of details that my mind struggled to process. The robes seemed to be made of darkness itself, not fabric, but the actual absence of light woven into something that approximated clothing. Beneath the hoods, where faces should be, there was only void. Not black, not empty, but a nothingness so complete it hurt to look at directly. My car was slowing down despite my foot pressed firmly against the accelerator. The speedometer needle dropped from 35 to 30, then 25, then 20. The engine continued to run smoothly, but our forward progress decreased with each loop, as if the very air was thickening into molasses around us. At 15 miles per hour, I could see individual details in the figure's non-faces, suggestions of eye sockets that contained no eyes, the hint of a mouth that opened onto emptiness, features that existed as negative space, defined by what wasn't there rather than what was. At 10 miles per hour, I could hear them, or thought I could. A sound like wind through empty spaces, like the echo of voices in abandoned buildings. Not quite whispers, not quite sighs, but something that lived in the space between those things. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the car despite the closed windows and making my eardrums ache with pressure. At 5 miles per hour, they began to move toward the car. The movement was wrong in every conceivable way. They didn't walk or glide or float. They simply existed in one location and then existed in another, closer location, as if space itself was contracting around them. Distance became meaningless as they approached, reality folding in on itself like origami made of nightmares. I watched in the rearview mirror as figures closed in from behind while others approached from the sides. My breathing had become so rapid and shallow that spots danced in front of my eyes, and I realized I was on the verge of passing out. But unconsciousness would leave me helpless, and some part of me understood that staying awake was the only thing keeping me human in this place. The speedometer hit 0. The car stopped. The figures surrounded me completely now. A circle of hooded shapes pressing close to the windows. I could see my own terrified reflection repeated in the glass, distorted by the curves and angles until I looked like a stranger even to myself. Sweat had soaked through my shirt and pooled in the small of my back. My hands shook so violently that I couldn't have operated the door handles even if I'd wanted to. But they didn't try to enter the car. They simply stood there, surrounding me in perfect silence. Their void faces turned toward me with an attention that felt like physical pressure against my skin. Waiting for something. Expecting something. That's when I noticed the GPS screen had changed. Instead of showing the circular route that had trapped me here, it now displayed a single word in large, friendly letters. Choose. Below that word, 2 options appeared. Continue loop. Exit navigation. My finger hovered over the screen, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. The figures remained motionless around the car, patient as death itself. I understood somehow that this was the moment everything had been building toward, not an ending, but a choice that would determine what kind of ending I would face. The continue loop option pulsed softly, hypnotically. I could imagine what that would mean. An eternity trapped in this 23-minute circuit, watching the same landmarks pass by while the figures stood guard around the perimeter of my prison. Not death, but something arguably worse. Endless repetition without hope of escape or change. But exit navigation offered no guarantees either. It might return me to the real world, to normal roads and rational GPS behavior. Or it might simply be another kind of trap, a different flavor of nightmare designed to exploit whatever choice I made. I thought about my life before this moment. My job, my apartment, my routines and relationships, and all the small certainties that had once seemed so solid. Were they real? Or had they always been just another kind of loop? Had I been trapped long before I ever turned onto this road, going through the motions of existence without ever truly living? The figures waited. The GPS waited. Even my own breathing seemed to pause as I reached the moment of decision. I pressed exit navigation. The screen went dark. The engine turned off. The headlights died. Complete darkness enveloped the car, and for one terrible moment I thought I had chosen wrong, that this was simply a different kind of trap, darkness instead of endless motion. But then I heard it. The distant sound of traffic. Real traffic, with the Doppler shift of vehicles passing at highway speeds. Light began to creep in around the edges of my vision, not the sickly glow of my headlights, but the warm orange of sodium vapor street lamps. I was sitting in my car in a rest stop parking lot, surrounded by other vehicles and the comforting hum of civilization. The GPS screen showed my actual location, exit 47 on Interstate 95, exactly where I should be according to my planned route home. I sat there for a long time, engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel, waiting for my heartbeat to return to something approaching normal. The digital clock read 12:23 a.m., exactly the time it should be if I had driven straight through without any detours or impossible loops. But my shirt was still soaked with sweat, my hands still trembling, and when I checked the GPS history, it showed no record of any alternate route. According to the device, I had driven directly from the conference to this rest stop without deviation. I never learned what the figures were, or what would have happened if I had chosen to continue the loop. But sometimes, during long drives on dark roads, I catch myself checking the GPS obsessively, watching for any signs that the route might be changing into something impossible. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I think I see a tall, hooded shape standing at the edge of the highway. I always take the main roads now. Always. Story 9. Some places exist beyond the reach of natural law, where the very air tastes of secrets and the shadows move with purpose. The Whitmore Library was such a place, though I wouldn't understand this until it was far too late to turn back. The isolation hit me first as my rental car crunched over the gravel driveway. Miles of dense forest had given way to this solitary Victorian mansion, its Gothic windows staring down like hollow eyes. No other buildings in sight, no power lines threading through the trees, just this monument to forgotten knowledge squatting in a clearing that seemed carved from the wilderness by an unsteady hand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the front steps, each board groaning under my weight with sounds that seemed too deliberate, too knowing. The brass knocker was ice cold against my palm despite the summer heat, and when I lifted it, the metal felt strangely viscous, as if reluctant to let go. No one answered my knock. The envelope containing my instructions had been crystal clear. The key would be under the third stone from the oak tree. I found it exactly where promised, the metal warm and slick with condensation that had no business existing in this dry air. My fingers trembled as I turned it in the lock, and the door swung open with a whisper that sounded almost like relief. The interior reeked of aged paper and something else, something organic and sour that made my nostrils flare involuntarily. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through tall windows, creating patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The entrance hall stretched before me, lined with portrait frames that held only empty canvases, their ornate gold borders gleaming dully in the half-light. My employer had contacted me through a third-party agency, explaining through written correspondence that he required a professional cataloger for his private collection. The pay was exceptional, enough to clear my mounting debts and fund my research for the next year. All I had to do was spend 2 weeks organizing and cataloging approximately 3,000 volumes, most of which were reportedly rare first editions and manuscripts. The owner would not be present during my work, preferring to maintain his privacy while allowing me complete access to the collection. The library itself occupied the mansion's entire ground floor, a cavernous space that seemed to swallow light despite dozens of windows. Towering shelves stretched from floor to vaulted ceiling, connected by a maze of rolling ladders and narrow catwalks that creaked ominously in the perpetual draft. The books sat in no apparent order, leather-bound tomes nestled against paperback novels, ancient texts sharing space with what appeared to be handwritten journals bound in materials I couldn't identify. I set up my laptop and organizing supplies on a massive oak table that dominated the room's center, its surface scarred with what looked like claw marks. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton, broken only by the soft settling of old wood and the occasional rustle of pages turning somewhere in the stacks, though I was alone in the building. My stomach twisted with each unexplained sound, cold sweat beading on my forehead despite the room's chill. I told myself it was just the building settling, old bindings contracting in the changing temperature. But my peripheral vision kept catching movement in the shadows between the shelves, fleeting shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. The work began routinely enough. I started with the nearest shelf, carefully removing each volume to record its title, author, publication date, and condition. Most were exactly what I'd expected: classic literature, historical texts, scientific treatises dating back centuries. But as the afternoon wore on, I began noticing oddities that made my pulse quicken and my mouth go dry. A biography of Napoleon contained an extra chapter detailing a campaign that had never happened. A medical textbook included procedures using instruments that didn't exist. Small discrepancies at first, easily dismissed as printing errors or fictional works masquerading as nonfiction. But the wrongness accumulated like static electricity, raising the fine hairs on my arms and making my skin crawl with invisible insects. It was near sunset when I found the first book about myself. The volume was bound in deep burgundy leather that felt warm and slightly sticky under my fingertips. No title marked the spine or cover, just smooth leather that seemed to pulse faintly in the dying light. Inside, handwritten text filled every page in neat, cramped script that made my eyes water to read. But the words were unmistakably clear, unmistakably accurate, and unmistakably about me. The opening page described my birth with clinical precision, the hospital room number, the exact time, my weight and length, even the rainstorm that had lashed the windows during my mother's labor. Details I'd never shared with anyone, information that existed only in medical records and my mother's fading memory. My hands shook as I turned the pages, finding my childhood laid out in excruciating detail. My first words, the scar I'd gotten falling from my bicycle, my secret crush on my second-grade teacher. Cold perspiration soaked through my shirt as I read about my teenage years, my college experiences, my failed relationships and professional disappointments. The writing continued right up to the present moment, describing my arrival at the library with an accuracy that made my vision blur and my breathing turn shallow and rapid. But the most disturbing part was what came next. The narrative didn't stop at the present. It continued forward, describing events that hadn't happened yet. Or had they? According to the text, I would work late into the night, driven by a compulsion I couldn't resist. I would discover more books about myself, each one containing different versions of my life, different choices, different outcomes. And with each book I read, reality would begin to shift around me. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, some elaborate hoax designed to unnerve me. But my body betrayed my skepticism. My heart thundered against my sternum, my palms slicked with sweat, and my throat constricted until each breath became a conscious effort. The logical explanation collapsed under the weight of details no one else could possibly know. As if drawn by invisible strings, I continued searching the shelves. Within an hour, I'd found 17 more books about my life. Each one told a different story, showed different paths, different versions of events I remembered living. In one, I'd married Sarah, my college girlfriend, and we'd had 3 children before divorcing bitterly. In another, I'd never left my hometown, instead taking over my father's hardware store and drinking myself into an early retirement. A third showed me as a successful academic, publishing groundbreaking research on medieval manuscripts. The books were affecting more than just my mental state. The library itself seemed to be responding to my discoveries. Shadows moved independently of their sources, stretching and contracting like living things. The temperature dropped with each volume I opened until my breath came out in visible puffs that dissipated into spiral patterns that resembled writing. The sound of pages turning echoed from empty sections of the library, growing louder and more frequent as the night progressed. Most unnervingly, objects in the library began changing to match the book's descriptions. A photograph on the mantelpiece, one that had shown an empty frame when I arrived, now contained a picture of me receiving an award I'd never won. A diploma hung on the wall with my name, from a university I'd never attended, for a degree I'd never earned. My reflection in the library's mirrors began showing me in clothes I wasn't wearing, sometimes decades older or younger than my actual age. My grip on reality loosened with each discovery. I found myself checking my pockets obsessively, confirming I still carried my own wallet, my own keys, my own identity. But even these familiar objects seemed foreign in my hands, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who merely looked like me. The worst part was the growing certainty that I was being watched, not by cameras or hidden observers, but by something far more intimate and invasive. It felt as though the books themselves were observing me, evaluating my reactions, documenting my terror for inclusion in yet another volume. Every movement felt choreographed, every thought monitored and recorded. Around midnight, I discovered the book that broke my remaining composure entirely. This volume was larger than the others, bound in black leather that seemed to absorb the lamplight around it. The pages inside weren't handwritten, but printed in a font I recognized from academic journals. The title page read, "A complete psychological profile and behavioral analysis of subject 847, Michael Harrison." My name. My life reduced to a case study. The book contained detailed psychological evaluations I'd never undergone, brain scans I'd never taken, interviews with family members and friends who'd apparently discussed my most private thoughts and fears. It included transcripts of conversations I remembered having differently, emails I was certain I'd never sent, and a comprehensive analysis of my personality that was more accurate and penetrating than any self-reflection I'd ever managed. According to this clinical assessment, I suffered from a rare form of dissociative disorder that caused me to lose track of large portions of my life. The missing time was filled with alternate personalities who made different choices, lived different experiences, and created different histories. The medication I'd been taking for what I thought was mild anxiety was actually a powerful antipsychotic designed to suppress these alternate selves. But the medication was failing. The alternate personalities were breaking through, manifesting as changes in my environment and false memories of lives I'd never lived. The books weren't documenting different versions of my life. They were created by my fractured psyche, elaborate fantasy worlds constructed to explain the gaps in my memory and the inconsistencies in my perception of reality. My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the chair behind the oak table. The library spun around me as my vision narrowed and my chest tightened with panic. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life, about reality itself, crumbled like pages in a fire. The books scattered across the table seemed to pulse with malevolent life, their text writhing and reforming as I watched. But even as I accepted this explanation, part of me rebelled against it. The books were too real, too detailed, too consistent in their impossibility. If they were products of my diseased mind, why did they feel more authentic than my actual memories? Why did the alternate histories seem more vivid and complete than the life I thought I'd lived? I spent the remaining hours until dawn reading voraciously, consuming every version of myself the library contained. Some books showed me as a killer, others as a saint. In one, I was a famous artist. In another, I never left my childhood bedroom. Each narrative felt completely true while I read it, only to be contradicted by the next volume. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the library's windows, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. New books were appearing on the shelves, volumes that hadn't been there the night before. I approached them with trembling hands and discovered they all bore recent dates, chronicling events from the past few hours. These new books described my night in the library, but from dozens of different perspectives. In some, I'd fled screaming into the forest. In others, I'd burned the building down. Several depicted me calmly continuing my cataloging work as if nothing unusual had happened. And in one, I'd never left the library at all, becoming another forgotten volume on the shelves, my life story joining the countless others that lined the walls. The final book I found was still being written. The pages were warm to the touch, and fresh ink glistened on the topmost lines. It described my current moment, my discovery of this very book, my growing understanding of what the library truly was, and my realization that I had a choice to make. I could leave immediately, flee to the safety of the outside world, and spend the rest of my life wondering whether anything I experienced had been real. Or I could stay and continue reading, learning every possible version of my existence, every path not taken, every choice unmade. The book's final words, written in ink still wet enough to smear, offered a third option. I could add my own pages to the collection, documenting the one version of my life that I knew to be completely, unquestionably true, the one I was living at this very moment. I lifted the pen that had appeared beside the open book, its weight familiar and strange in my hand. Outside, my rental car waited in the gravel driveway, engine still warm, keys in my pocket. The forest beyond offered escape, normalcy, the comfort of a world where books didn't write themselves and mirrors showed only what stood before them. But as I stared at the blank page, I understood with crystalline clarity that some discoveries change you so fundamentally that returning to ignorance becomes impossible. The library had shown me the infinite malleability of existence, the countless selves I could have been, could still become. The pen trembled in my grip as I began to write, adding my voice to the chorus of possibilities that filled the Whitmore library. And somewhere in the stacks, new books materialized to contain whatever truth I chose to create, whatever reality I dared to make real. The shadows watched approvingly as my words took shape on the page, and the library settled around me like a familiar embrace, welcoming its newest chronicler home. Story 10. The silence in Millbrook was wrong, not peaceful, wrong. It pressed against my eardrums like water, thick and suffocating, broken only by the whisper of wind through dead leaves and the distant hum of insects that seemed to grow quieter each day. Even the birds had learned to muffle their songs here, as if afraid of disturbing something better left undisturbed. I should have recognized the warning signs immediately. The moving truck had barely disappeared around the bend when Mrs. Garrett from next door appeared at my doorstep with a casserole dish wrapped in checkered cloth. Her smile was warm enough, but her eyes kept darting toward the horizon where the sun hung low and orange, already threatening to sink behind the tree line. She spoke quickly about neighborhood customs and local grocers, her words tumbling over each other in what seemed like rehearsed urgency. When I mentioned planning to take evening walks to explore the area, her face went pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. She mumbled something about how it was best to stay indoors after dark, how the roads weren't safe, how people preferred their privacy during the nighttime hours. Then she was gone, hurrying back to her own house with an almost frantic pace that made my stomach twist. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. The townspeople were friendly enough during daylight hours, waving from their porches, nodding politely at the general store, offering helpful directions when I got lost on the winding country roads. But there was something rehearsed about their interactions, like actors following a script they'd memorized long ago but never quite believed in. Old Mr. Peterson, who lived across the street, would wave enthusiastically from his garden each morning, calling out cheerful greetings about the weather. But when evening approached, he'd disappear inside his house so quickly, it was as if the setting sun physically repelled him. By the time twilight painted the sky purple, every window on the street glowed yellow behind drawn curtains, and the neighborhood became a collection of isolated lighthouses in an ocean of darkness. I tried to rationalize it. Rural communities had different rhythms, different traditions. Maybe they were early risers who valued their sleep. Maybe there had been some incident in the past that made them cautious about nighttime activities. But my logical explanations felt hollow, like whistling past a graveyard to keep the shadows at bay. The first time I tested their unspoken curfew was on a Thursday night, when insomnia had me pacing the floors of my new house. The digital clock on the microwave read 11:47 p.m. when I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the sensation hit me like a physical blow. Every house on the street was not just dark, it was watching. I could feel eyes pressed against windows, peering through gaps in curtains, tracking my movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just paranoia, but the primitive part of my brain screamed danger with every step I took down the sidewalk. I made it 3 houses before the fear became unbearable. The weight of that collective gaze pressed down on me until my breathing became shallow and rapid. My hands started to shake, and I found myself walking faster, then jogging, then practically running back to my front door. The moment I was inside with the lock turned, the sensation vanished completely, leaving me gasping and confused in my living room. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. During the day, Millbrook felt like any other small town. Quiet, peaceful, slightly boring. But as soon as the sun began its descent, an invisible transformation would occur. The air itself seemed to thicken, and shadows took on weight and substance that made them feel alive. Even inside my house with all the lights on, I could sense something prowling in the darkness beyond my windows. I started paying closer attention to my neighbor's behavior. Mrs. Garrett would begin closing her shutters at exactly 7:30 p.m., regardless of the season or sunset time. Mr. Peterson had installed motion sensor lights around his property, but they never seemed to activate, as if whatever moved through his yard at night knew exactly how to avoid triggering them. The family in the blue house at the end of the street had boarded up their basement windows completely, hammering thick plywood over them with rusty nails that looked like they'd been there for years. Sleep became elusive, every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the siding, every distant sound that might have been an animal or might have been something else entirely, would jolt me awake with my pulse racing. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds that seemed to circle my house like predators testing the perimeter of a camp. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I first heard the sounds from Mr. Peterson's basement. The noise began around 2 a.m., a rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from underground, traveling through the earth and up through the foundation of my house. At first I thought it might be pipes or perhaps some kind of mechanical issue. But as I pressed my ear to the floor, the sound resolved into something more disturbing. Deliberate scraping, like claws against stone, accompanied by what might have been muffled vocalizations. My mouth went dry, and my hands began to tremble as I realized the sounds were coming from the direction of Peterson's property. The scratching would continue for hours, sometimes punctuated by heavy thuds that made my windows rattle in their frames. During the day, Mr. Peterson continued his cheerful morning routine as if nothing had happened, but I noticed dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch in his left hand that hadn't been there before. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of home improvement project. Maybe he was renovating his basement and preferred to work at night to avoid disturbing the neighbors. But the sounds were too organic, too alive. They had a desperate quality that made my stomach churn with unease. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when the scratching was accompanied by what I could only describe as sobbing. Deep guttural sounds that weren't quite human, but weren't quite animal either. Something in that anguished noise bypassed my rational mind completely and triggered a primal terror that left me shaking and nauseous. I had to know what Peterson was keeping down there. The next evening, I positioned myself at my bedroom window with a pair of binoculars I'd found in the moving boxes. Peterson's house sat on a slight elevation, and I had a clear view of his backyard and the exterior basement entrance, a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal strips. As darkness fell, Peterson emerged from his house carrying what looked like a large bucket. Even from a distance, I could see his hands shaking as he approached the basement door. He fumbled with multiple locks. I counted at least 4 different deadbolts before disappearing into the underground space. The sounds that followed made my blood freeze in my veins. The scratching intensified, joined by a rhythmic thumping that seemed to shake the very ground. But most disturbing were the vocalizations, a mixture of growls, whimpers, and something that might have been words if words could be spoken by a throat not designed for human speech. Peterson emerged 15 minutes later, stumbling and pale in the moonlight. The bucket was empty now, and he moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of someone in shock. He locked the basement door with the same meticulous care, testing each deadbolt twice before hurrying back into his house. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the binoculars steady. Whatever was down there, whatever Peterson was keeping trapped in his basement, it was alive and aware and suffering. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a poisonous weight, making it impossible to eat or sleep or think about anything else. I spent the next day researching the property records at the county courthouse. Peterson had lived in that house for nearly 30 years, but there was something odd about the building permits. Multiple applications for basement modifications had been filed over the years. Reinforced walls, soundproofing, specialized drainage systems. Each permit was stamped and approved, but the descriptions were vague and the explanations inadequate. That night I made a decision that would change everything. At 1:30 a.m., I crept out of my house wearing dark clothes and rubber-soled shoes. The neighborhood was silent except for that ever-present scratching sound emanating from Peterson's basement. My heart pounded so hard I was certain the entire street could hear it, but I forced myself to move forward across the dew-wet grass. The basement door was even more formidable up close. The wood was thick and scarred, reinforced with metal bands that looked like they'd been added in layers over many years. The locks were serious affairs, deadbolts and chain locks, and even what appeared to be a sliding bolt bar across the entire width of the door. But Peterson had been careless in his haste. One of the deadbolts hadn't engaged properly, leaving a gap just wide enough for me to work my fingers into. The wood was old and slightly warped, and with careful pressure I managed to widen the gap enough to peer inside. The darkness beyond was absolute, but the sounds were much clearer now. The scratching was definitely coming from something with claws, and the vocalizations had an almost conversational quality, as if whatever was down there was trying to communicate, but lacked the proper vocal apparatus. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight app, angling the beam through the gap in the door. What I saw made my knees buckle, and my vision blur at the edges. The basement had been converted into a cell. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, and thick chains hung from bolts embedded in the concrete floor. But it was the occupant that sent ice water through my veins. The creature was roughly humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Its limbs were too long and bent at impossible angles, covered in skin that seemed to shift and ripple in the harsh light from my phone. What might have been a face turned toward me, revealing features that belonged to no earthly taxonomy. Multiple eyes that reflected the light like a nocturnal animal's, and a mouth that opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth that grew in spiraling patterns. But the most horrifying aspect wasn't its alien physiology. It was the unmistakable intelligence in those clustered eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was aware, conscious, and absolutely terrified. The creature made a sound that might have been my name, if names could be spoken by vocal cords made of nightmares. Its elongated limbs reached toward the door with desperate urgency, chains clanking against the concrete floor. I stumbled backward, my phone clattering to the ground and plunging everything into darkness. Behind me, I heard the sound of a door opening and footsteps on grass. Peterson's voice cut through the night, steady and resigned. He explained that he'd been expecting this moment for years, that he'd seen me watching from my window. The creature in his basement wasn't malevolent, he said. It was a refugee, something that had fled from a place where its kind were hunted and tortured by beings even more terrible than itself. He told me how it had appeared in his backyard 30 years ago, dying and desperate, speaking in broken English about persecution and genocide occurring in dimensions adjacent to our own. How he'd made the decision to hide it, to protect it, even though the responsibility had slowly consumed his life and sanity. The other neighbors knew, of course. They'd all agreed to the unspoken contract that kept Millbrook safe. Stay inside after dark, don't ask questions, and never speak of what couldn't be explained to outsiders. The creature needed to feed on certain energies that were abundant during nighttime hours, and its presence had side effects that made prolonged exposure dangerous for human minds. As Peterson spoke, I felt my perception of reality cracking like a window under pressure. The quiet friendliness of the townspeople wasn't just small-town hospitality. It was the careful courtesy of people sharing a terrible secret. The evening curfew wasn't paranoid behavior. It was a survival strategy developed over decades of coexistence with something that didn't belong in our world. The creature in the basement wasn't a prisoner. It was a protected species, hidden away from a universe that wanted it dead. And now I was part of the conspiracy, whether I wanted to be or not. Peterson offered me a choice: leave Millbrook immediately and never speak of what I'd seen, or stay and accept the responsibility that came with knowledge. The creature was dying, he explained. After 30 years of hiding, its body was finally breaking down. Soon they would need someone younger, someone stronger, to take over its care. I looked back at the basement door, knowing those alien eyes were watching from the darkness beyond. My hands were still shaking, and cold sweat had soaked through my shirt. But beneath the terror was something else. A recognition that some responsibilities couldn't be walked away from once you understood their true nature. The next morning, I called the moving company to cancel the pickup I'd tentatively scheduled. Mrs. Garrett brought me another casserole, and this time her smile reached her eyes. Mr. Peterson waved from his garden, but now I could see the profound exhaustion in his shoulders. The weight of 3 decades spent protecting something the world would never understand. I've been in Millbrook for 6 months now. I still don't go outside after dark, and I've learned to ignore the sounds that come from Peterson's basement. But lately, I've started researching basement renovations and soundproofing techniques. Peterson isn't getting any younger, and the creature's needs aren't going to change. Some nights, when the scratching is particularly urgent, I stand at my window and look down at that reinforced basement door. I know that eventually, I'll be the one carrying the bucket down those concrete steps, the one testing the locks twice before hurrying back to safety. And despite everything, despite the fear and the sleepless nights, and the constant weight of a secret that sits like lead in my chest, I think I'm beginning to understand why the people of Millbrook chose to stay. Because sometimes the most human thing you can do is protect something that has nowhere else to go, even when that something comes from a place where humanity itself might be considered the monster. The scratching has stopped now. The basement is quiet, but I know it's just resting, gathering strength for another night in its endless exile, and I'm learning to be okay with that. Story 11. The rain hammered against my windshield like desperate fingers clawing for entry, each drop exploding into fractured light under the street lamps. 3:17 a.m. The city had transformed into something alien. Empty streets, glistening like black oil, shadows pooling in doorways where they had no business being. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, chasing surge pricing through the metropolitan wasteland, when my phone chimed with a pickup request from an address I didn't recognize. The GPS guided me through increasingly desolate neighborhoods, past shuttered businesses and abandoned lots where weeds pushed through cracked concrete like arthritic fingers. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing beyond their reach. The address led me to a street corner where broken streetlights created pools of absolute blackness between flickering patches of sickly yellow illumination. He was standing there when I arrived, though I hadn't seen him approach. A tall figure in a dark coat, perfectly still despite the driving rain that should have sent anyone with sense running for shelter. Water streamed down my passenger window, distorting his features into something fluid and uncertain. When he climbed into my back seat without a word, the temperature inside my car dropped noticeably. My breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The smell hit me immediately. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong somehow. Like ozone before a thunderstorm mixed with something metallic and old. Mothballs, maybe, or the musty scent of a house that had been closed up for too long. I glanced in my rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at my passenger, but the angle was wrong, the shadows too deep. All I could make out was the vague outline of his form and 2 pale hands resting motionlessly on his knees. I waited for him to give me a destination, following the usual script of polite driver conversation, but he remained silent. The seconds stretched uncomfortably as rain continued its assault on the car's exterior. Finally, without turning his head or speaking, he raised one pale hand and pointed straight ahead down the empty street. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and somehow final. My hands trembled slightly as I put the car in drive. The steering wheel felt slick under my sweating palms despite the cold. Something fundamental felt wrong about this situation, but I couldn't articulate what. The passenger hadn't threatened me, hadn't done anything overtly menacing. Yet every instinct I possessed screamed danger with increasing volume as we drove deeper into the industrial district. The city grew stranger around us. Streets I thought I knew led to places that didn't match my mental map. Buildings loomed higher than they should have. their windows dark and reflective like dead eyes. Traffic lights hung at intersections where I was certain none had existed before, cycling through their colors for an audience of empty streets. When I tried to consult my GPS, the screen showed only a blue dot floating in a void of gray. No streets, no landmarks, no indication of where we might be heading. My passenger continued his silent direction system, pointing left or right at seemingly random intervals. His movements had a mechanical quality, as if he were following a route programmed into his very being. I found myself obeying these gestures without question, though some rational part of my mind kept insisting I should pull over, demand an explanation, or simply end the ride. But every time I considered stopping, a crushing weight would settle on my chest, making it difficult to breathe, and I would press on instead. The neighborhoods grew progressively more desolate. Streetlights became sporadic, then vanished entirely. The buildings changed too, from industrial warehouses to abandoned residential blocks where broken windows stared out like accusations. Some structures looked as though they'd been empty for decades, their facades crumbling and overgrown with vegetation that seemed too vibrant for the dead surroundings. It was in one of these forgotten neighborhoods that I first noticed the other cars. They appeared sporadically, sometimes approaching from side streets, sometimes following at a distance, always driving with the same deliberate purposefulness that characterized my mysterious passenger. But when I tried to get a better look at their drivers, my vision would blur, or shadows would shift just enough to obscure the details. More unsettling still, these vehicles never seemed to fully obey the laws of physics. A sedan would disappear around a corner that was too sharp for its speed, or headlights would approach from impossible angles. My breathing had become shallow and rapid. Each inhalation felt insufficient, as if the air inside the car had become thin and insubstantial. Sweat ran down my back, despite the bone-deep cold that had settled into the vehicle's interior. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violence that I could hear it echoing in my ears above the sound of rain and engine. The passenger pointed again, directing me onto a narrow road that shouldn't have existed. It was little more than cracked asphalt bordered by tall grass that bent away from our headlights as if recoiling from the light. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the cloudy night sky. In this tunnel of vegetation, the only sounds were the rumble of my engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. That's when I tried to catch a glimpse of my passenger in the mirror again, and felt my stomach drop into free fall. The reflection showed only an empty back seat. My eyes darted frantically between the mirror and the actual seat behind me, where I could clearly see his silhouette, could smell that strange metallic odor, could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his presence. But the mirror insisted he wasn't there. I pulled over abruptly, my hands shaking so violently I could barely control the steering wheel. The car lurched to a stop on what passed for a shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. I twisted around in my seat to face my passenger directly, needing to confirm his reality with my own eyes. He was there. Absolutely, undeniably present. His face remained hidden in shadow, but I could see the wet fabric of his coat, the pale skin of his hands, the subtle rise and fall of his chest that suggested breathing. When I looked back at the mirror, however, it continued to show an empty back seat, as if he existed in some space that reflective surfaces couldn't access. My mouth had gone completely dry, my tongue feeling thick and useless. I tried to speak, to ask who he was or what he wanted, but only a croaking sound emerged. The passenger seemed to sense my distress because he raised his hand again, this time pointing directly ahead down the narrow road that disappeared into absolute darkness between the trees. I found myself putting the car back in drive despite every rational thought screaming at me to flee. My foot pressed the accelerator of its own accord, as if controlled by some external force. The vehicle crept forward into the tunnel of branches, headlights revealing only a few feet of cracked asphalt at a time. The trees began to change as we progressed. Their bark took on an oily sheen that reflected our headlights in unnatural ways. Some appeared to have faces pressed into their trunks, human features distorted by the wood's texture, mouths open in silent screams or expressions of desperate pleading. When I blinked hard and looked again, they were just trees. but the impression of watching eyes lingered at the edges of my peripheral vision. My passenger had become completely motionless, no longer pointing directions. Perhaps he didn't need to. The road continued straight ahead with no alternatives, but his presence had intensified somehow, as if he were drawing energy from our surroundings and concentrating it within the car's cramped interior. The cold had become so severe that I could see my breath in thick clouds, and ice began forming at the edges of the windows despite the night's relative warmth outside. The road finally opened into a circular clearing where my headlights illuminated what appeared to be the ruins of an old building. Columns of weathered stone stood at odd angles, supporting nothing but empty air. Fragments of walls suggested this had once been a substantial structure, though its original purpose remained unclear. In the center of the ruins sat a circular depression filled with black water that perfectly reflected the sky despite the total absence of light. I felt compelled to stop the car at the edge of this clearing, though I couldn't remember making the conscious decision to do so. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent. Even the rain had stopped, though I couldn't recall when. The absence of sound was so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. My passenger finally moved, reaching for the door handle with that same deliberate slowness that had characterized all his actions. But before he could exit, I forced myself to turn around completely and look directly at him, needing to see his face, to understand what I had been transporting through the night. The shadows fell away from his features like a curtain being drawn back, and I found myself staring into my own face. Not a resemblance or a similarity. My exact features reflected back at me with perfect, impossible precision. But the eyes were wrong. Where mine held confusion and terror, his contained a bottomless emptiness that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of his skull. He smiled with my mouth, and when he spoke, it was with my voice, though I had heard him say nothing throughout our entire journey together. "Thank you for bringing me home," he said, each word echoing strangely in the car's interior. "I've been looking for this place for such a long time." The door opened, and he stepped out into the clearing, his footsteps making no sound on the wet ground. He walked toward the ruins without looking back, his form becoming indistinct in the darkness beyond my headlights. At the edge of the black pool, he paused and turned toward the car one final time. In that moment, I understood with horrible clarity that this hadn't been a random pickup, hadn't been chance that brought us together on this night. He had been waiting for me specifically, had somehow known I would be the one to respond to that request, the one to drive him to this forgotten place between the city and somewhere else entirely. As he stepped into the dark water and vanished beneath its surface without causing so much as a ripple, I felt something shift fundamentally in the world around me. The clearing began to fade at its edges, the ruins becoming translucent and insubstantial. Within moments, I found myself sitting in my car on a perfectly ordinary street corner in a neighborhood I recognized, city lights blazing around me, traffic moving normally in all directions. But the cold remained, settled deep in my bones like a permanent winter. And when I looked in my rearview mirror now, I sometimes saw an empty back seat when I knew it should show my own reflection. The GPS showed my location clearly, marking exactly where I was supposed to be, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed in the spaces between the mapped world. I never drove for the app again after that night. But sometimes when it's raining and the city takes on that particular quality of emptiness, I catch glimpses of other drivers with passengers they can't see in their mirrors, following directions to destinations that don't appear on any map, transporting things that shouldn't exist back to places that never quite leave them. Story 12. The silence in Raven's Hollow Manor was never truly silent. Even before I heard my first whisper from the walls, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the place. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken words, pressing against my eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. I should have walked away the moment I saw the job posting. Temporary caretaker needed for historic property, minimal duties, generous compensation for right candidate. Must be comfortable with isolation. The pay was 3 times what any reasonable caretaker position offered, which should have been my first red flag. But my bank account was hemorrhaging money faster than my pride could bleed, and desperate men don't ask questions about suspiciously good fortune. The estate manager, Mrs. Whitmore, met me at the iron gates with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her features unnaturally. When she handed me the keys, her fingers were ice cold despite the warm September afternoon. Mrs. Whitmore explained that my duties would be simple: walk the grounds twice daily, ensure no windows or doors had been damaged by weather or trespassers, and report any significant issues to her office in town. She mentioned that the manor had been empty for 18 months since the last caretaker had left suddenly, citing personal reasons. She didn't elaborate, and something in her tone suggested I shouldn't ask. The manor loomed before me like a Gothic monument to architectural excess. Built in 1847 by railroad magnate Harrison Ravenshollow, it stood 3 stories tall with dark stone walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Twisted spires clawed at the sky, and dozens of windows stared out like dead eyes. The covered walkways and shadowed alcoves created a maze of darkness, even in broad daylight. Mrs. Whitmore led me through the main entrance into a grand foyer that smelled of dust and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, leaving the interior perpetually dim. The furniture was covered in white sheets that looked like shrouds in the half-light. She showed me to the caretaker's quarters on the first floor, a modest apartment that had been modernized with basic amenities. The rooms were clean, but felt oppressive, as if the walls were slowly closing in. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that the electricity worked throughout the building, though she recommended keeping lights to a minimum to avoid unnecessary attention from locals. Before leaving, she paused at the front door and turned back to me with that same hollow smile. She suggested I might hear settling noises from such an old building, and that I shouldn't concern myself with every creak and groan. Old houses, she said, had their own language. Then she drove away, leaving me alone with the weight of the manor pressing down on my shoulders. The first night passed quietly. I made myself dinner in the small kitchen, unpacked my few belongings, and tried to familiarize myself with the layout. The manor was a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, hidden passages, and narrow staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. Many doors were locked, and Mrs. Whitmore had given me keys only to the essential areas. I fell asleep to the sound of wind rattling the windows, and the occasional settling groan from the old wooden beams. Normal sounds for a house this age, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The whispers started on the second night. I was lying in bed, hovering between sleep and wakefulness, when I heard them. Soft murmurs coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. At first, I thought it might be the heating system or pipes, but as I strained to listen, the sounds resolved into something unmistakably human. Voices, muffled and indistinct, having conversations I couldn't quite make out. My heart rate accelerated as I sat up in bed, listening intently. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions: the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath me. They were layered, overlapping, like hearing a crowded restaurant from the next room. I could distinguish different tones and rhythms, but the words remained frustratingly unclear. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices grew slightly clearer, and I caught fragments. Told you he wouldn't. Never should have. Too late now. The conversations had the cadence of real human speech, but they felt ancient, like recordings from another era. After an hour of listening, the voices gradually faded, leaving me wide awake and questioning my sanity. I spent the rest of the night with every light in my apartment burning, telling myself it was just old pipes or perhaps acoustic tricks played by the wind and the building's unusual architecture. The third night, the whispers returned stronger and more distinct. This time I could make out entire phrases floating from the walls. He won't last long, and they never do. And most unsettling, he can hear us now. My mouth went dry as sand. The voices weren't random conversations. They were talking about me, My hands shook as I reached for the lamp, flooding the room with harsh electric light. But the voices continued, unbothered by the illumination. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, a chorus of the unseen discussing my presence with casual indifference. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps previous caretakers had left recordings as some kind of prank. Maybe the building's acoustics were carrying sounds from somewhere else, radio broadcasts perhaps, or conversations from a neighboring property. But the manor was isolated by acres of overgrown grounds, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Sleep became impossible. I paced my apartment, following the voices as they moved through the walls like schools of fish through water. Sometimes they seemed to be in the room with me, and I would spin around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But I was always alone with the shadows and the persistent murmuring that had become the soundtrack to my growing dread. By the fourth day, exhaustion was taking its toll. My eyes burned with fatigue and my hands trembled constantly. I caught myself jumping at every settling sound, every whisper of wind through the eaves. The voices had become a constant presence, chattering away just beyond the threshold of understanding. I could feel them watching me, judging me, waiting for something. During my afternoon walk through the manor, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found scratch marks on the walls, not random gouges, but deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing. The marks were fresh, cutting through decades of paint and wallpaper down to the bare wood. But I was the only person in the building. That evening, the voices changed. Instead of casual conversation, they began to whisper my name. "David," they called softly from within the walls. "David, can you hear us?" The sound of my own name spoken by invisible mouths sent waves of ice through my veins. My breathing became shallow and rapid, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I tried leaving my apartment, thinking distance might help, but the voices followed me through the manor like a pack of hunting dogs. They grew louder in certain rooms and softer in others, but they never completely disappeared. The whispers multiplied, overlapping and echoing until they became a symphony of disembodied voices all focused on me. "David's afraid now," one voice observed with what sounded like amusement. "He should be," another replied. "They always break eventually," a third added, and several others made sounds that might have been laughter. My chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. The voices weren't just talking about me anymore. They were taunting me. Every breath felt labored, as if the air itself had become thick and hostile. I stumbled back to my apartment and locked the door, though I knew it wouldn't keep out whatever was speaking from inside the walls. The fifth night brought a new horror. The voices began to repeat things I had said, words I had spoken when I thought I was alone. They echoed my phone conversations with my mother, my muttered complaints about the job, even my private thoughts that I had voiced to myself. It was as if the building itself had been recording everything, storing my words to play back in its supernatural chorus. I realized with growing terror that the voices weren't random echoes from the past. They were aware, conscious, and they had been studying me. Every day I stayed, they learned more about me, absorbed more of my essence into their collective whisper. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I could barely eat, and when I tried to sleep, the voices would grow louder, more insistent. They told me things about myself that I'd never spoken aloud, secrets I thought were locked safely in my mind. They knew about my failed marriage, my financial troubles, my deepest fears and regrets. The walls had become confessionals, and I hadn't realized I was the one confessing. On the sixth day, I found more scratch marks, this time in my own apartment. They had appeared overnight on the wall beside my bed, and this time I could read them clearly. "Become one of us." Terror clawed at my throat. Whatever intelligence haunted this place, it wasn't content to simply observe. It wanted something from me, and I was beginning to understand what. The voices weren't just echoes of past conversations. They were the trapped essence of previous caretakers, previous visitors, people who had stayed too long and become part of the manor's supernatural collection. I tried to call Mrs. Whitmore, but my phone had no signal. The landline in the kitchen produced only dial tone. Though I could swear I heard whispers underneath the electronic hum, I was completely cut off, trapped with the voices that grew stronger and more numerous each day. That night, the voices stopped whispering and began to speak at normal volume. They filled every room with conversations about their lives, their deaths, their transformation into whatever they had become. I learned that the manor was a trap, a supernatural snare that fed on human consciousness. The longer someone stayed, the more of themselves they left behind, until eventually there was nothing left but another voice in the walls. I packed my belongings with shaking hands, determined to leave at dawn. But when I tried to sleep, the voices began to sing, a haunting harmony that seemed to resonate in my bones. The melody was beautiful and terrible, and despite my fear, I found myself relaxing, listening, almost enjoying the ethereal music that surrounded me. That's when I realized the true horror of my situation. Part of me was beginning to like the voices. After days of isolation, they had become my only companions. They knew me completely, accepted my flaws, offered a form of twisted intimacy that I had never experienced with another living person. The idea of leaving them, leaving this place where I was truly understood, began to feel wrong. I jerked awake with a start, horrified by my own thoughts. The voices were changing me, slowly eroding my sense of self and replacing it with something else. I could feel pieces of my identity dissolving, being absorbed into the collective consciousness that haunted the manor. With desperate determination, I grabbed my bags and ran for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard my own voice speaking from the walls behind me. "Don't leave us, David. You belong here now." The voice was mine, but I hadn't spoken the words. Somehow the manor had already claimed enough of me to create its own David voice, another whisper to add to its collection. My legs nearly gave out as I realized how close I had come to joining them permanently. I threw open the door and ran into the pre-dawn darkness, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, I could hear the voices calling after me, pleading for my return. But underneath their entreaties, I heard something else: disappointment. They had been so close to claiming another soul for their eternal conversation. I never returned to collect my final paycheck. Mrs. Whitmore called once, asking if I had encountered any problems, and I told her I had found other employment. She accepted my explanation without question, almost as if she had expected it. Sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I think I can still hear them, faint whispers from walls that shouldn't be able to speak. And the most terrifying part is that sometimes I find myself straining to listen, hoping to catch just one more fragment of their endless, seductive conversation. Part of me, I realize, never truly left Ravenshollow Manor at all. Story 13. Some things refuse to die. This truth settled into my bones 3 weeks after the storm, when I realized the overhead light in my living room had never fully turned off since that night. It hung there like a dying star, pulsing with sickly yellow light that seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. The storm had been violent. Lightning split the sky open while thunder shook my apartment building's foundation until I thought the whole structure might collapse. When the power died, I sat in complete darkness for 6 hours, listening to the wind tear at my windows like desperate fingers. When the electricity finally returned, everything seemed normal, except for that damned light. I tried the switch countless times, flicked it up, down, up again. The light would dim to almost nothing, but never complete darkness. A weak, trembling glow persisted, casting everything in sickly amber shadows. I checked the bulb, twisted it until my fingers ached, even replaced it entirely. Nothing changed. The new bulb behaved exactly like the old one, as if the fixture itself had developed some cancerous need for illumination. My landlord, a gruff man named Peterson, dismissed my concerns when I called. He mumbled something about electrical surges from the storm and promised to send someone eventually. That was 2 weeks ago. The maintenance request disappeared into the building's bureaucratic void, and I was left alone with my persistent, unwelcome companion. At first, the light was merely annoying. I hung thick curtains, bought blackout shades, anything to block its reach when I tried to sleep. But sleep became elusive for other reasons. The shadows cast by that faltering bulb moved in ways that defied logic. Where normal shadows remained static, these writhed and shifted across my walls like living things. I told myself it was fatigue. Working 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm had ground my nerves raw even before the storm. Stress manifested in strange ways, and shadow watching was probably just another symptom of my deteriorating mental state. But the rational explanations crumbled as the images became clearer. The first distinct shape appeared on a Tuesday night. I was eating a frozen dinner when movement caught my peripheral vision. On the wall beside my kitchen doorway, a shadow had formed that looked unmistakably like a man hanging from a rope. Every detail was crisp: the tilted head, the dangling arms, even the gentle swaying motion. My fork clattered to the floor as I spun to locate the object casting such a shadow. Nothing. The space between the light and wall was empty. When I turned back, the shadow was gone. My hands shook as I picked up the fork. A cold sweat had broken out across my forehead, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spent the rest of the evening pressed against the opposite wall, watching that space with the intensity of a prey animal scanning for predators. Nothing reappeared, but I felt observed, studied, as if something behind the walls was taking careful notes. Sleep that night was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hanging figure burned into my retinas. When exhaustion finally dragged me under around 4 a.m., my dreams were filled with rope and shadows, and the sound of creaking wood. The next shadow appeared 3 days later. This time, it was a woman crawling across my bedroom wall, her limbs bent at impossible angles, mouth stretched wide in what could have been a scream or laugh. She moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a broken marionette operated by a drunk puppeteer. The image lasted nearly 10 minutes before dissolving back into ordinary shadow patterns. I called in sick to work the following day. My boss's voice crackled through the phone, expressing concern about my recent performance decline, but I barely heard him. Every word felt distant and hollow, filtered through layers of growing dread. I spent hours researching electrical phenomena, searching for scientific explanations for shadow distortions, reading medical articles about stress-induced hallucinations. Nothing matched what I was experiencing. The shadows grew bolder. They appeared more frequently, staying longer, becoming increasingly detailed. I witnessed scenes of violence that made my stomach churn. Figures locked in brutal struggle, hands wrapped around throats, bodies contorted in agony. But worse than the violence were the quiet moments. Shadows that simply stood and watched me, their presence so tangible I could feel their weight pressing against my consciousness. My appetite vanished. Food turned to ash in my mouth while phantom watchers observed every bite. I lost 12 pounds in 2 weeks, my clothes hanging loose on my shrinking frame. Dark circles carved themselves under my eyes, and my hands developed a constant tremor that made simple tasks feel monumental. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I was attempting to read when the shadows on my living room wall began forming a scene so detailed and horrifying that my mind recoiled from processing it fully. Multiple figures engaged in acts that violated everything decent and human. The images moved with fluid precision, a silent movie projected by hell itself onto my wall. I lunged for the light switch, flipping it desperately. The shadows dimmed but didn't disappear, continuing their grotesque performance in muted tones. I grabbed a chair and climbed toward the fixture, intending to rip the bulb out with my bare hands. But the moment I touched the glass, an electric shock threw me backward onto the floor. Pain exploded through my shoulder where I hit the hardwood, but the physical injury was nothing compared to what happened next. As I lay gasping on the floor, the shadows began moving toward me, not just shifting or changing position, actually flowing down the wall like liquid darkness, pooling at the baseboards before creeping across the floor in my direction. Terror locked my muscles solid. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch those impossible shadows advance. They moved with purpose, reaching toward me with tendrils of concentrated darkness that seemed hungry for contact. When the first shadow touched my leg, cold shot through my entire body like injected ice. The touch lasted only seconds, but in that contact, images flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine, experiences I'd never lived. I saw through the eyes of the hanging man, felt his final moments of desperation and regret. I experienced the crawling woman's last moments of sanity before something fundamental snapped inside her mind. Every shadow that had performed on my walls was a person, a life story compressed into darkness and transmitted through that cursed light. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't random images or stress hallucinations. They were souls, trapped somehow in the electrical current, forced to reenact their final moments for anyone unfortunate enough to witness their eternal performance. I crawled backward until my spine hit the wall, watching the shadows retreat to their usual positions. But now I understood what I was seeing. Every night, dozens of people's last moments played out on my walls, their consciousness somehow caught in the building's electrical system since that storm. The light hadn't malfunctioned. It had become a portal, a window into something that existed parallel to our reality. For 3 days, I didn't enter the living room. I sealed myself in my bedroom, surviving on crackers and water bottles, trying to convince myself that isolation would make the problem disappear. But on Saturday night, shadows began appearing on my bedroom walls. The migration had begun. Sunday morning brought a moment of terrible clarity. Standing in my bathroom, studying my gaunt reflection in the mirror, I realized the truth that had been building in my subconscious for weeks. The shadows weren't just showing me random souls, they were collecting them, and I was being prepared for addition to their number. The realization should have broken me, but instead it brought strange calm. Understanding my situation, even if I couldn't change it, was better than uncertainty. I spent that day putting my affairs in order, writing letters to my sister and parents that I'd never send, cleaning the apartment until every surface gleamed. That evening, I returned to the living room for the first time in days. The light pulsed its sickly welcome, and within minutes, the shadows began their show. But this time, instead of recoiling, I watched with acceptance. These souls were trapped, forced to relive their darkest moments for eternity, and soon I would join them, unless I found a way to break the cycle. The solution came to me near midnight, elegant in its simplicity. The light fed on electrical current, but it also fed on fear and isolation. Every moment I spent alone and terrified strengthened its hold. But what if I refused to be alone? I called the only person who might understand, my neighbor Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived in the building for 30 years. When she answered the phone, her voice heavy with sleep, I explained everything. The persistent light, the moving shadows, the trapped souls. I expected disbelief, maybe a suggestion that I seek professional help. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment before admitting she'd had her own experiences with unexplained phenomena in the building. Other tenants had mentioned strange electrical problems since the storm, shadows where shadows shouldn't exist, feelings of being watched. She agreed to come over. Mrs. Chen arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a thermos of tea and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen enough of life to accept its stranger aspects. We sat together in my living room, and something remarkable happened. The shadows still appeared, but they seemed less substantial, their movements sluggish and uncertain. She explained that her grandmother had told her stories about spirits caught between worlds, usually at places where trauma occurred. Buildings, she said, could hold memories, especially after violent weather that stirred up energies that normally lay dormant. The solution wasn't to fight the phenomenon, but to acknowledge it, to give the trapped souls permission to move on. Together, we spoke to the shadows. We acknowledged their presence, their pain, their right to find peace. Mrs. Chen whispered prayers in Mandarin while I offered simple words of recognition and release. Gradually, the shadows began to fade, not disappearing but losing their frantic energy, their desperate need to reenact trauma. The light still flickers in my living room. I suspect it always will. But the shadows no longer torment. They simply exist, occasional glimpses of lives that once were, now acknowledged and allowed their dignity. I've learned to coexist with the remnants of others' stories, and in doing so, I've ensured my own story won't end in shadow. Sometimes, Mrs. Chen visits for tea, and we sit in that amber glow, two living people keeping vigil over those who've passed. The light doesn't seem hungry anymore. It simply illuminates, casting ordinary shadows that behave as shadows should. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the building shakes, I sometimes catch glimpses of new shadows beginning to form, and I remember that some lights, once lit, refuse ever to die completely. Story 14. The lake had always been wrong, but I only understood this after 3 sleepless nights on the houseboat. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped the weathered railing, staring down at water that shouldn't exist in nature. Black as tar beneath the overcast sky, it stretched endlessly in all directions, swallowing the horizon like a hungry mouth. The surface lay perfectly still, yet the houseboat rocked with persistent rhythmic movements that made my stomach lurch with each sway. No wind disturbed the air. No current should have moved us. But the wooden floor beneath my feet never stopped its gentle, nauseating dance. I'd come here to escape the noise of the city, to find silence in this remote lake house rental that promised solitude and peace. The property owner had mentioned the houseboat was included, moored permanently to the floating dock system. What he hadn't mentioned was how the water would make my skin crawl just by looking at it. 3 days ago, I'd thought the delayed reflection was a trick of light. Standing at the edge of the deck, I'd raised my hand to shade my eyes from the pale morning sun. In the water below, my reflection had lagged behind by a full second before mimicking the gesture. I'd attributed it to fatigue from the long drive, perhaps some optical illusion caused by the unusual density of the water. But now, as I leaned over the railing with my pulse racing, I watched my reflection smile before my own lips had even thought to curve upward. The image in the water grinned with genuine warmth, while my face remained locked in a grimace of growing terror. My reflection's eyes crinkled with joy as my real eyes widened with horror. The wooden planks creaked beneath my shifting weight as I stumbled backward from the railing. My throat had gone dry as sandpaper, and each swallow felt like grinding glass. The houseboat continued its relentless rocking, though the lake surface remained undisturbed by even the smallest ripple. I forced myself to look away from the water and focus on the distant shoreline, but even that offered no comfort. The trees stood too straight, their branches reaching skyward at identical angles, as if planted by some obsessive architect. No birds moved among the leaves. No insects buzzed through the stagnant air. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep, muffling even the sound of my own ragged breathing. When I'd first arrived, I'd noticed the collection of toy boats scattered across the deck. Dozens of them in various sizes and colors. Plastic sailboats, rubber dinghies, wooden tugboats with tiny smokestacks. The property owner had mentioned them during our phone conversation, explaining that previous guests often brought toys for their children to play with in the shallow areas near shore. He'd suggested I might enjoy using them myself, claiming that adults often found floating the tiny vessels surprisingly relaxing. I'd ignored them initially, dismissing them as childish clutter. But now, as my nerves frayed like worn rope, I found myself studying their placement. They weren't scattered randomly as I'd first assumed. Instead, they formed perfect concentric circles around a central point on the deck, as if arranged by careful hands for some specific purpose. The late afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the deck. The temperature should have been dropping with the approaching evening, but the air remained thick and oppressive, clinging to my skin like wet fabric. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the lack of heat, and I wiped it away with trembling fingers. As darkness crept across the water, I retreated inside the houseboat's cramped interior. The main room combined kitchen, living area, and dining space into a claustrophobic box lined with dark wood paneling. A single overhead light flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The windows, which should have offered views of the lake, now reflected only the dim interior, turning them into black mirrors that showed my face pale and drawn with exhaustion. I tried to prepare a simple dinner, but my hands shook too violently to manage even basic tasks. The sound of the knife against the cutting board echoed strangely in the confined space, each chop seeming to come from multiple directions at once. When I turned on the small radio to fill the oppressive silence, only static emerged from the speakers, occasionally interrupted by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't identify. Sleep had become impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, the gentle rocking of the houseboat transformed into violent pitching that left me clutching the narrow bed frame. But when I opened my eyes, the movement immediately returned to its previous gentle rhythm. My body couldn't adjust to the constant motion, leaving me nauseated and disoriented. During my second sleepless night, I'd heard the sounds begin, soft splashing from outside, as if something large moved through the water near the houseboat. But when I peered through the windows, the lake surface remained perfectly smooth. The splashing continued for hours, circling the houseboat in slow, deliberate patterns. Sometimes it sounded like swimming strokes, other times like something much larger displacing massive amounts of water with each movement. By the third night, the sounds had grown bolder. Heavy footsteps crossed the deck above my head, though I knew myself to be alone. The footsteps moved with purpose, walking from one end of the boat to the other before stopping directly overhead. Then silence would fall for exactly 13 minutes. I'd begun counting to maintain my sanity, before the footsteps resumed their methodical pacing. Now, as the fourth evening approached, I stood again at the deck railing despite every instinct screaming at me to stay inside. The reflection in the water had become more than delayed. It had begun acting independently. As I watched in growing horror, my reflection waved enthusiastically while my own arms remained rigid at my sides. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, its expression animated and excited, as if trying to communicate some urgent message. Behind my reflection, shapes moved through the dark water. At first, I thought they might be fish, but their movements were too deliberate, too coordinated. They approached the surface in formation, and as they drew closer, I realized they were the toy boats from the deck, but they moved under their own power, their tiny forms cutting through the water with mechanical precision. The plastic sailboats reached my reflection first, bumping gently against the image in the water. But instead of passing through as they should have, they collided with my reflection as if it possessed physical substance. The impact caused ripples to spread outward from the point of contact, distorting my reflection's face into a grotesque smile that stretched impossibly wide. More toy boats joined the first, approaching from all directions. They moved with increasing speed, deliberately ramming into my reflection with tiny but audible impacts. Each collision produced a soft thunk that I felt vibrate through the houseboat's hull. My reflection seemed to enjoy the attention, laughing silently as the boats surrounded it completely. The temperature around me began to drop rapidly. My breath became visible in short puffs that hung in the still air like smoke signals. Ice crystals formed on the railing beneath my white-knuckled grip, and the metal burned against my palms with cold. But the water below remained unfrozen, still reflecting my image with perfect clarity despite the sub-freezing air. I tried to speak, to call out some challenge to whatever force controlled my reflection, but my voice emerged as only a strangled whisper. The cold had numbed my throat, and each attempt at sound sent shooting pains through my chest. My reflection continued its silent conversation with the toy boats, gesturing animatedly as they circled in tighter and tighter spirals around its submerged form. The boats began to organize themselves into patterns, first forming letters, then words. I watched in paralyzed fascination as they spelled out messages in the water around my reflection. Come down. Join us. The water is warm. Your place is here. My legs trembled so violently I could barely remain standing. The houseboat's rocking had intensified, though the water's surface remained mirror smooth. Each sway threatened to pitch me over the railing and into the waiting darkness below. My reflection gestured more urgently now, pointing upward toward where I stood, then downward into the depths. Behind me, I heard the sound of the interior door opening and closing, though I knew I'd left it securely latched. Footsteps crossed the main room with deliberate slowness, each step accompanied by the creak of old floorboards. The sounds approached the exterior door that led to the deck, where I stood frozen in terror. The door opened with a long, rusty groan. Cold air rushed past me, carrying the smell of stagnant water and something else, something organic and decaying that made my stomach clench with revulsion. But when I forced myself to turn around, nothing stood in the doorway. The entrance gaped empty and black, leading into the houseboat's dark interior. More toy boats had emerged from the depths, dozens of them now, creating an entire fleet around my reflection. They moved in perfect synchronization, forming complex geometric patterns that shifted and reformed with mechanical precision. The patterns resembled symbols or letters from some unknown alphabet, messages written in a language my mind couldn't process but my body understood with primitive fear. My reflection had stopped its animated gesturing and now stood perfectly still in the water, staring directly up at me with an expression of infinite patience. Its smile had faded to a neutral expression that somehow seemed more threatening than any grin. It waited with the stillness of deep water, watching me with eyes that held knowledge I didn't want to possess. The toy boats began to move toward shore, carrying their mysterious message away from my reflection and toward the distant bank. But instead of traveling in straight lines, they moved in a complex spiral pattern that made my eyes water to follow. The spiral seemed to extend infinitely inward, creating an optical illusion that threatened to pull my consciousness down into the water with my watching reflection. I realized then that I had been gripping the railing for so long that my hands had cramped into permanent claws around the metal. When I tried to release my grip, my fingers wouldn't respond. The cold had numbed them beyond feeling, but some deeper force seemed to hold them in place, anchoring me to the spot above the water where my reflection waited with eternal patience. The sun had completely disappeared now, though I couldn't remember watching it set. The darkness felt absolute, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. Only the pale glow emanating from the water below provided any illumination, and that light seemed to come from my reflection itself, rather than any external source. In that unnatural glow, I saw my reflection begin to move again, but this time it wasn't gesturing or trying to communicate. Instead, it began to climb upward through the water, its movements slow and deliberate as it approached the surface. The toy boats scattered from its path, creating a clear channel for its ascent. As my reflection drew closer to the surface, I could see details that should have been impossible. Its hair moved differently than mine, flowing in currents that didn't exist. Its clothes were different too, older, more formal, as if it dressed for some important occasion I couldn't comprehend. Most disturbing of all, its age seemed different. While I stood 34 years old and weathered by life's accumulated stress, my reflection appeared younger, smoother, unmarked by the years that had carved lines around my eyes and mouth. The reflection reached the surface and broke through with a sound like glass shattering in reverse. Water poured away from its emerging form, but the form itself cast no ripples. It stood now on the surface of the lake as if the water were solid ground, facing me directly across the short distance that separated the houseboat from the deep water. We stared at each other in perfect silence. The reflection's chest rose and fell with breathing I couldn't hear. Its eyes blinked in rhythms that didn't match my own. Most terrifying of all, its mouth began to move, forming words I couldn't understand but felt in my bones like vibrations from some vast, hidden machinery. Then it began to walk toward the houseboat, its feet finding purchase on the water's surface with each step. The toy boats followed in its wake, creating a small flotilla that moved with military precision. With each step my reflection took, I felt my own feet grow heavier, as if some invisible force were trying to root me to the deck. The reflection reached the side of the houseboat and placed its hands on the hull just below where I stood. The wood groaned under its touch, and I felt the vibration travel up through the boat's structure and into my bones. My reflection looked up at me with an expression of gentle disappointment, as if I had failed to understand some simple lesson it had been trying to teach. Then it began to climb. Its hands found holds in the smooth wood where none should have existed. It pulled itself upward with fluid grace, moving like someone intimately familiar with this exact ascent. The toy boats arranged themselves in the water below, forming a perfect circle as if to catch anything that might fall. As my reflection climbed higher, I felt my own strength drain away. My grip on the railing finally loosened, and I stumbled backward across the deck. But instead of collapsing, I found myself moving toward the interior door, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't resist. I understood then what was happening. The reflection wasn't trying to join me, it was trying to replace me, and I was being pulled toward the water to take its place in that dark mirror world below the surface. The interior of the houseboat had changed. The walls now curved inward like the inside of a barrel, and the ceiling had dropped so low I had to duck to avoid hitting my head. Everything seemed designed for someone smaller, younger, more suited to life in confined spaces. Behind me, I heard my reflection reach the deck. Its footsteps crossed the wooden planks with the confidence of ownership, moving toward the railing where I had stood moments before. Through the windows, I could see it take up position at the exact spot I had occupied, looking down into the water with satisfaction. The door behind me closed with finality that echoed through the transformed interior. I was trapped inside while my reflection claimed the outside world. But as I pressed my face against the window, watching my doppelganger survey its new domain, I realized the truth was far more complex. In the water below, a new reflection had appeared. Mine, but wrong in all the ways the original had been right. This reflection looked older, more tired, marked by experiences I had never lived. It waved up at the figure on the deck with desperate urgency, trying to communicate some warning about the world above. I understood then that this exchange had happened before, many times. The houseboat was a way station, a place where reflections and reality traded places in an endless cycle. The toy boats weren't toys at all. They were markers, breadcrumbs left by previous travelers who had discovered the truth too late. The figure on the deck, wearing my face but not my soul, turned to look directly at me through the window. It smiled with genuine warmth, the expression I had seen in the water during those first terrifying days. Then it raised one hand in a gesture of farewell and began walking toward the door that would lead it away from the houseboat forever. I remain here still, watching through windows that now reflect only darkness, while somewhere in the world above, my reflection lives the life I thought was mine. The toy boats have returned to their circles on the deck, waiting patiently for the next traveler to discover their message. And in the water below, my new reflection waves frantically, trying to warn me about truths I'm only beginning to understand. The houseboat rocks gently in water that never moves, and I've learned to time my breathing to its rhythm. Sometimes I think I can hear my reflection calling from below, its voice carried on currents that exist only in the space between what is and what appears to be. But I no longer look down at the water. I've learned that some reflections are best left undisturbed. Story 15. The mirror chose me long before I chose it. I should have walked away the moment I saw my face staring back from that tarnished glass, surrounded by the chaos of the antique fair. Something in that reflection wasn't quite right. A subtle wrongness that made my stomach clench and my skin crawl. But the vendor, a weathered woman with yellowed teeth, was already wrapping the ornate frame in old newspapers, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she muttered about what a steal it was at $50. The thing weighed more than it should have. As I carried it to my car, the wrapped mirror pressed against my chest like a cold, dead weight. My arms ached by the time I reached the parking lot, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out across my forehead, despite the October chill. The newspaper crinkled with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon air. At home, I unwrapped it in my bedroom, peeling away the yellowed paper with trembling fingers I couldn't quite explain. The mirror's surface was pristine despite its obvious age. Not a single scratch marred the glass, though the ornate bronze frame showed centuries of wear. Baroque angels twisted around the edges, their faces worn smooth by time, their eyes seemingly following my movements as I positioned the mirror against the wall opposite my bed. The moment I stepped back to admire my purchase, My heart skipped. My reflection moved a fraction of a second behind me, like a badly synced video. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with the heels of my palms until spots danced in my vision. When I looked again, everything appeared normal. My reflection mimicked my movements perfectly, raising its hand when I raised mine, tilting its head in unison with my own. Exhaustion, I told myself. It had been a long day at the fair, walking for hours under the sun. My mind was playing tricks on me. That night I caught myself glancing at the mirror more often than usual as I prepared for bed. Each time, my reflection behaved normally, but an uncomfortable sensation lingered in my chest, the feeling of being watched by hostile eyes. When I finally turned off the lights and slipped under the covers, the mirror's surface gleamed faintly in the darkness, catching stray light from the street lamp outside. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of standing in front of the mirror, while my reflection remained perfectly still, its eyes boring into mine with malevolent intelligence. The next morning brought the first undeniable sign that something was wrong. As I brushed my teeth, I noticed the delay again, subtle but unmistakable. When I moved the toothbrush to the left side of my mouth, my reflection followed a heartbeat later. The lag was barely perceptible, perhaps half a second, but it sent ice water through my veins. I stood frozen, toothbrush hanging from my lips, white foam dripping into the sink. My reflection had stopped moving entirely, its mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on mine with an expression I hadn't made. The face in the mirror looked hungry. My hand shook as I reached up to wipe the foam from my chin. In the mirror, my reflection's hand remained at its side. For 5 eternal seconds we stared at each other, two different people wearing the same face. Then, slowly, deliberately, my reflection smiled. It was my smile, technically, but I wasn't smiling. The expression was cold, calculating, and utterly alien despite being formed by lips identical to my own. I stumbled backward, my hip colliding painfully with the doorframe. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was perfectly normal again, mimicking my shocked expression with flawless synchronization. The incident left me shaken for the rest of the day. At work, I found myself unable to concentrate, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding my reflection in windows and computer screens. My colleagues asked if I was feeling all right, noting the dark circles under my eyes and the way my hands trembled when I reached for my coffee cup. I brushed off their concerns with vague mentions of poor sleep, but the truth was far more disturbing. That evening, I considered covering the mirror or moving it to another room, but something held me back. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or maybe the mirror itself exerted some inexplicable influence over my decisions. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring into its depths as daylight faded outside my window. The delay was more pronounced now. When I raised my hand, my reflection took nearly a full second to follow. When I stood, it remained seated for several heartbeats before slowly rising. The lag created a nauseating disconnection between reality and reflection, like watching myself in a funhouse mirror designed by a malevolent god. As the room grew darker, the delay stretched longer. My reflection began moving independently for brief moments, scratching its nose when I hadn't moved, tilting its head to study me while I sat perfectly still. The familiar features of my face took on alien qualities in the mirror's surface. The eyes seemed darker, more deeply set. The mouth appeared wider, the lips thinner and more cruel. By midnight, the reflection had stopped following my movements altogether. While I sat on the bed, frozen with terror, the figure in the mirror stood and began exploring the boundaries of its prison. It pressed its palms against the glass from the inside, and I swear I could hear the faint sound of skin against cold surface. Its mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Let me out. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought it might burst. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt and my breathing came in short, ragged gasps. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that mirrors didn't work this way, that I was suffering some kind of breakdown. But the evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and terrifying. The reflection began to change in subtle ways. Its hair grew slightly longer, its face a bit thinner. The clothes it wore, my clothes, appeared newer, cleaner, as if it existed in some perfected version of my reality. Most disturbing of all, it looked healthier than me. While I sat pale and trembling, my skin slick with nervous perspiration, the reflection appeared calm, confident, even attractive in a way I'd never considered myself to be. It was becoming a better version of me. Over the following days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The reflection now lived its own life entirely, moving freely within the confines of the mirror while I went about my daily routine. Sometimes I would catch it sleeping when I was awake, or eating when I wasn't hungry. It had developed its own schedule, its own preferences, its own personality. Worse, it had begun trying to communicate. I would find messages written backward on the mirror's surface, appearing in the condensation after hot showers or traced in dust that accumulated impossibly quickly. Soon, they would say, or almost ready, or most chillingly, you won't need that body much longer. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom, choosing instead to collapse exhaustedly on the living room couch each night. But even there, I could feel the mirror's presence like a malignant tumor in my home. My appetite vanished, and my weight dropped dramatically. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my hands developed a persistent tremor that made simple tasks difficult. The reflection, meanwhile, grew stronger and more solid-looking with each passing day. Its movements had gained a fluid grace that my own body lacked. When it smiled, which it did often now, always when I was watching, the expression radiated confidence and barely contained malice. My breaking point came on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after purchasing the mirror. I had finally worked up the courage to return to my bedroom, intending to cover the damn thing with a sheet and figure out how to dispose of it safely. But as I stepped through the doorway, I saw something that froze my blood in my veins. The reflection was no longer in the mirror. Instead, it stood in my bedroom, solid and real and impossibly present. It wore my face, my clothes, my body, but everything about it radiated wrongness. The smile it gave me was triumphant and predatory, the expression of something that had finally achieved a long-sought goal. We stared at each other across the small space of my bedroom, two identical men with vastly different intentions. My double looked exactly as I should have looked, well-rested, confident, attractive. I, meanwhile, appeared exactly as I felt, hollow-eyed, trembling, broken. The thing that wore my face took a step toward me, and I noticed that it cast no reflection in the mirror behind it. The mirror's surface showed only my bedroom, empty except for furniture, and the pale, terrified man standing in the doorway. Me. "You're tired," it said, and its voice was my voice but somehow wrong, like hearing a recording of yourself played at the wrong speed. "You should rest." I tried to run, but my legs felt leaden, unresponsive. The double moved closer, each step measured and deliberate. As it approached, I felt a strange pulling sensation in my chest, as if something vital was being drawn out of me. "Don't fight it," the thing whispered, now close enough that I could smell my own cologne on its skin. "You'll be so much happier on that side. No responsibilities, no stress, no fear, just existing." Its hand reached toward my face, and I understood with crystal clarity what was happening. It wanted to switch places completely, to take my life while I became trapped in the mirror's cold reflection. I would become the prisoner, watching helplessly as this superior version of myself lived the life I had built. The touch of its fingers against my cheek sent electricity shooting through my nervous system. I felt myself beginning to fade, becoming translucent around the edges. The room started to blur and shift, as if I were seeing it through water or thick glass. But then, in a moment of desperate clarity, I realized something crucial. If it was here, outside the mirror, then the mirror was empty. The prison was vacant, waiting for a new occupant. With the last of my strength, I lunged forward, not away from my double, but toward it. My hands found its shoulders, solid, warm, disturbingly real, and I drove both of us backward toward the mirror's ornate frame. The collision with the glass felt like plunging into an Arctic lake, Cold beyond description enveloped us both as we tumbled through the mirror's surface, reality bending and twisting around us like molten metal. For a moment that lasted eternity, we struggled in that liminal space between worlds, two versions of the same person fighting for the right to exist. Then suddenly I was standing alone in my bedroom, gasping and shaking. The mirror showed only my reflection, haggard, traumatized, but undeniably real. My double was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. But when I looked closely at my reflection, I noticed something that made my newly steady heartbeat falter. My reflection was smiling, just slightly, with an expression I hadn't made. And in its eyes, my eyes, I saw a flicker of that same cold intelligence I'd grown to fear. The mirror still sits in my bedroom. I've tried to move it, to sell it, to destroy it, but somehow I always find myself making excuses to keep it. After all, the reflection behaves perfectly now, following my every movement with flawless precision. Though sometimes, late at night when I'm not paying attention, I catch it moving just a fraction of a second too late. And when that happens, I can't help wondering, which side of the mirror am I really on? The reflection in the glass smiles back at me as I write these words, and I notice that I'm not smiling at all. Story 16. The asphalt stretched endlessly ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the dying cornfields under a sky the color of old bruises. I'd been driving for 3 hours through back roads I'd never seen before, following what my GPS insisted was a shortcut to the interstate. The radio had given up miles ago, leaving only static and the rhythmic thrum of tires against cracked pavement. That's when I saw it. A phone booth stood alone in a barren field, its glass panels reflecting the last gasps of daylight like dead eyes. The red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and weeds grew thick around its concrete base. It shouldn't have been there. Phone booths were relics, extinct as dinosaurs. Yet there it stood, impossibly present, impossibly wrong. My foot eased off the accelerator without conscious thought. The car slowed, gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled onto the shoulder. The engine ticked in the sudden silence, cooling metal contracting with small, sharp sounds that made my skin crawl. Through the windshield, the phone booth waited. I told myself it was curiosity that made me climb out of the car. Just a harmless detour, a chance to see something unusual. But my hands trembled as I locked the doors, and sweat had already begun to bead along my hairline despite the October chill. The field stretched away on all sides, empty except for dead corn stalks that rustled without wind. My footsteps sounded too loud on the hard-packed earth, each step echoing strangely in the vast emptiness. The phone booth grew larger as I approached, its details becoming clearer and more unsettling. Scratches covered the glass like claw marks. The metal framework showed rust spots that looked disturbingly organic, spreading across the surface like veins or infection. The door hung slightly ajar, darkness pooling inside where the light couldn't reach. I paused at the threshold, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smell hit me then, musty air thick with decay and something else, something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. But I pushed the door open anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The interior was impossibly cold. My breath misted as I stepped inside. The temperature dropped so sudden it felt like walking into a morgue. The old rotary phone hung from its metal cord, the receiver black and heavy-looking. Numbers and letters had been carved into the metal walls around it, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. I reached for the receiver, my fingers numb with cold. The plastic felt warm against my ear, pulsing slightly like living flesh. My other hand moved to the rotary dial, but before I could turn it, a sound emerged from the earpiece. Breathing. Not the mechanical hiss of a dead line, but slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation. Human breathing. If humans could breathe with that particular wetness, that suggestion of fluid and decay. My grip tightened on the receiver, every instinct screaming at me to hang up. to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. Instead, I pressed the phone closer to my ear. The voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Deep and resonant, it seemed to emerge not from the phone but from inside my own skull. It spoke my name first, drawing out each syllable with obscene familiarity. Then it began to tell me things. It knew about the scar on my left shoulder, hidden beneath my shirt. The one I'd gotten falling off my bike at age 7. The one I'd never told anyone about because I'd been embarrassed about crying. It knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother's purse when I was 12, $5 that had eaten at my conscience for months. It recounted the exact words I'd whispered to Sarah Matthews at my high school graduation. Words of love that she'd never heard because I'd been too afraid to speak them aloud. My knees buckled. The phone booth walls seemed to press closer, the carved symbols writhing in my peripheral vision. Cold sweat ran down my spine as the voice continued its catalog of my secrets, moving through my life with surgical precision. It knew about the job interview I'd deliberately sabotaged because I was terrified of success. It described the night I'd sat in my car outside Amanda's apartment building, working up the courage to propose, only to drive away when I saw her silhouette in the window with another man. It whispered about the doctor's appointment I'd been postponing for months, the one where I was afraid to hear what those chest pains might mean. I tried to hang up, my fingers fumbling for the cradle, but the receiver seemed fused to my ear. The voice pressed on, relentless and intimate, stripping away layers of carefully constructed privacy until I felt raw and exposed. Then it began talking about things that hadn't happened yet. The voice described a red sedan that would pass my position in exactly 7 minutes, driven by a woman with short blonde hair who would be texting while driving. It told me about the argument I would have with my brother next Tuesday, complete with the exact words that would end our relationship forever. It painted a picture of the promotion I wouldn't get, because my supervisor had already decided to give it to someone else. But these revelations felt different, charged with a desperate urgency that made my chest tight with panic. The voice grew louder, more insistent, overlaying future events with a sense of impending catastrophe that I couldn't grasp but felt in my bones. It spoke of something watching me, something that had been following my movements for weeks without my knowledge. The voice described how it waited in the spaces between perception, in the blind spots of consciousness where awareness couldn't reach. It fed on attention, the voice explained, growing stronger each time someone noticed its presence. My hands shook violently now, the receiver slipping in my sweaty grip. The phone booth's interior had grown so cold that my breath came in sharp white puffs, and frost was beginning to form on the glass walls. The symbols carved into the metal seemed to pulse with their own dim light, creating patterns that suggested movement in my peripheral vision. The voice told me that my curiosity had been noticed, that stopping at this phone booth, listening to its secrets, had marked me somehow. It described how the thing that watched would begin appearing more frequently now. Glimpses of movement in darkened windows, shadows that didn't match their sources, the sensation of being observed when I thought I was alone. I yanked at the receiver again, putting all my strength into separating it from my ear. This time it came away with a wet, tearing sound that made me gag. But even with the phone hanging loose, I could still hear the voice, now emanating from the walls themselves, from the very air around me. The voice gave me one final gift, a detailed description of what would happen when I tried to leave. It told me about the car that wouldn't start, how the battery would be mysteriously drained despite being new. It painted a picture of the long walk I would take along the darkened road, thumb extended hopefully toward the few passing vehicles. Most would ignore me, but one would stop. The driver would be helpful, almost eager to assist. They would offer to take me to the nearest gas station, to call a tow truck, to solve all my problems with suspicious generosity. But their eyes would be wrong, the voice warned. Too bright, too knowing, reflecting light that wasn't there. I stumbled out of the phone booth, gasping in air that tasted clean and normal after the fetid atmosphere inside. My legs barely supported me as I staggered across the field toward my car, looking back only once to see the booth standing innocent and empty, its door swinging gently closed. The car key turned in the ignition, and nothing happened. No click, no grinding of the starter, no dashboard lights. Complete electrical silence. My hands fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The battery had been at 70% when I'd parked. Darkness was falling fast now, the sky deepening from purple to black with unnatural speed. Stars appeared overhead, but their patterns looked wrong, arranged in configurations that seemed to spell out words I didn't want to read. I began walking, each step taking me further from the phone booth but somehow not making me feel any safer. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, while behind me I could feel something watching from the abandoned booth. Not malevolent exactly, but interested in a way that made my skin crawl. After what felt like hours, headlights appeared in the distance. The car slowed as it approached, eventually pulling over with a soft hiss of brakes. The window rolled down, revealing a face that was perfectly normal and friendly, with eyes that reflected the darkness like polished glass. The driver asked if I needed help, voice warm with concern. They mentioned having jumper cables, offered to give me a ride to town, suggested calling 8AA from their phone. Everything the voice in the booth had predicted, down to the exact words and inflection. I declined politely, backing away from the car as casually as I could manage. The driver's expression never changed, but those two bright eyes followed my movement with predatory focus. After a moment that stretched far too long, they shrugged and drove away, leaving me alone with the darkness and the growing certainty that this was only the beginning. The phone booth's predictions hadn't been warnings, they'd been promises. And now, standing on that empty road with something vast and patient watching from the shadows, I understood that my real education in fear was just starting. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, while behind me the darkness pressed closer and the stars rearranged themselves into patterns that spelled out my name.